The first item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion number 3924 in the name of Derek Mackay on the Local Government Finance, Unoccupied Properties, etc. Scotland Bill. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Derek Mackay to speak to and move the motion. 14 minutes, Mr Mackay.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to open today's debate on the Local Government Finance, Unoccupied Properties, etc. Scotland Bill. First of all, can I welcome Margaret Burgess as Minister-Designate for Welfare and Housing to the Chamber and commend Keith Brown for his contribution in the housing portfolio. The bill before us will contribute to measures to reduce the number of empty properties, whether they be homes, shops or other commercial properties, so that we can make best use of existing buildings and minimise the number of properties falling into disrepair and becoming a blight on our communities. I would like to thank the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, the Finance and the Subordinate Legislation Committees for their scrutiny of the bill so far. I was pleased to see in the Stage 1 report that there is much common ground between the Scottish Government and Parliament in terms of the importance of tackling empty properties in this country. I am grateful to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee for its support for the general principles of the bill. Keith Brown, then Minister for Housing and Transport, and I have looked carefully at the recommendations made in the Stage 1 report. I will outline a number of actions proposed to respond to the issues raised. I will of course also be writing to the committee to respond to all of the recommendations in due course. Indeed, this debate will further contribute to the ongoing engagement I have committed to within and out with this chamber. I have met with a range of organisations, as the then Housing Minister had, to hear of the issues and look at how our proposals can be refined and improved, carefully listening as a Scottish Government to the experience of stakeholders, MSPs and councils. On council tax, we welcome the Local Government and Regeneration Committee's support for our commitment to tackling empty homes. We want to see a reduction in the 25,000 homes sitting empty long-term, while around 140,000 families are on waiting lists for a social rented home. We agree giving councils flexibility to increase council tax charges for certain long-term empty homes is a useful additional measure at their discretion, added to the toolbox of functions councils can deploy to help, encourage or, where needed, push owners not to leave their homes lying empty whilst there is such need. We also agree council tax is not the only answer. We have been funding the Empty Homes Partnership to provide support to councils in tackling empty homes. Now also part funding 3 empty homes officers on a pilot basis shared across 7 councils. We're pleased to say this is now starting to pay off as the number of councils actively working to tackle empty homes is increasing each year. While advice and support from a council can be enough in many cases, we also recognise some owners do need financial help to bring their homes up to standard. That's why we've doubled the amount available through the Empty Homes Loan Fund to £4 million. We'll make help available and bring back at least 160 extra homes through affordable housing, in addition to the existing £1.75 million of innovative empty homes projects we are already supporting. In relation to the increase, we have also taken on board comments about the need for clarity and avoid complexity in relation to types of empty home owners who deserve special treatment, so they are excluded from any council tax increase, therefore proposing to focus the exemptions only on those who are actively trying to bring their homes back into use, either for sale or for let. We're currently consulting on this and other aspects of the draft regulations, which flesh out the details of how any council tax increase would operate. In particular, in response to the Stage 1 recommendations as they relate to unoccupied homes, we're planning to bring forward the following amendments to the bill at Stage 2. To increase the maximum level of a penalty charge, a council can charge an owner who fails to provide information about whether their home is unoccupied from £200 to £500. As the committee suggested, this should help deter owners from either deliberately avoiding providing information or providing false information. Also, to limit within the bill itself the maximum amount of council tax increase to 100% of the applicable standard rate, rather than just placing these restrictions in the regulations, responding to the concerns raised by the Subordinate Legislation Committee about the potential for future regulations to allow for higher increases. On business rates, we welcome the Committee's general support for the Bill proposals to allow us to bring forward regulations to reduce the level of empty property relief for empty commercial properties once they have been empty for over 3 months. I am continuing to talk to stakeholders about the provisions and state again we will return to Parliament with the details of the regulations should the bill be passed. An important point to note is that the bill itself makes no change to empty property rates relief as it currently stands. Rather, it creates an enabling power to increase or indeed decrease the rates discounts through regulations. This is no different from the ability the Government has to change many rates relief through regulations already, such as the Small Business Bonus Scheme or the UK's first and only renewable energy relief. I emphasise again that we remain flexible in our considerations. Yes, we must make savings as a consequence, of course, of deep UK government cuts, but we aim to ensure this acts as an incentive to bring empty properties back into use. This policy will therefore be supported by our efforts on regeneration and our imminent town centre review. Opposition for its own sake is no substitute for constructive suggestions to make the bill more effective, and that's why the stakeholder engagement has been so important. I welcome the encouragement from Mark MacDonald MSP to look at the incentivisation scheme in Northern Ireland, which provides relief to ratepayers after they fill empty properties, a further incentivisation, potentially as part of the package. I can confirm we are considering how such a scheme could operate in Scotland, and if supported, could form a Stage 2 amendment. Our stated intention from April 2013 is to vary the 50% discount empty properties receive after the first 3 months to 10%. I would reiterate, industrial and listed properties will continue to receive 100% discount for the duration they are empty, learning from the experiences elsewhere. In comparison to the council tax provisions, which could potentially affect some 25,000 homeowners, with potentially variable rates across the country for good reason, the changes to empty property relief will affect a much smaller number of property owners and be consistent across Scotland. Therefore, in view of this and the scale of the savings involved, it was decided that to conduct a business and regulatory impact assessment would have been disproportionate. Modest but necessary savings will come from this policy, £18 million a year from 2013-14, from a forecast business rates income of nearly £2.5 billion. The package of rates relief will remain the most generous in the United Kingdom. Indeed, the current cost of empty property rates relief is £757 million over the current 5-year revaluation period, more than the very popular and effective Small Business Bonus Scheme itself, which has made such a difference in these difficult times. Overall, rates relief per year now exceeds £500 million, and to ensure that this relief is properly focused on supporting sustainable economic growth, we will be shortly launching a consultation on the rates relief system. Presiding Officer, impact on the public sector was queried by the Finance Committee, and by providing estimates, we have shown the cost to the public sector is relatively minor. But the benefit to local government services is that all non-domestic rates are of course passed back to local government for the funding of local public services. Finally, we welcome the support in Stage 1 report of our plans to abolish the Housing Support Grant. The grant had become an anomaly since the introduction of the prudential borrowing regime, as the regime requires councils to make sure they only borrow funds they are confident they can pay back. Therefore, it must be councils' responsibility to make sure they can balance their housing revenue accounts each year. This will allow us to make better use of our housing funding by focusing only on key priorities in an equitable way, rather than simply servicing councils' interest on historic debts. Despite that, we recognise Shetland Island Council has continuing high levels of housing debt due to having borrowed significant amounts over many years from the Council's Harbour Fund. Minister Keith Brown met the new leader of the Council back in July and explained that the £15 million in funding being requested by the Council was not a realistic scenario. We're looking to the Council, as recommended, to take a hard look at its housing service to ensure sustainability, just as all other local authorities are required to do. I too have met with Shetland Council, and officials are currently in discussion about easing the affordable housing situation on the islands. I do believe there is a desire on this agenda to tackle the challenges inherited by the new Council administration going forward. So to conclude, I commit to further engagement, hope Parliament considers our amendments at stage 2 and in essence supports these key measures to bring empty properties that blight our communities, domestic and non-domestic, back into use. I therefore move the motion that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Local Government Finance, Unoccupied Properties, etc. Scotland Bill.
Thank you very much, Minister. I now call on Kevin Stewart, who is speaking on behalf of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. Mr Stewart, you have 10 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And first of all, can I thank all of those who gave evidence, either written or oral, to the committee, which helped us in our deliberations, and also to the clerking team of the committee, who, as per usual, were excellent in the task that they had to deal with. It would be fair to say that on a number of things we had unanimous agreement in the committee, and in others there was somewhat more controversy, and I'm sure other members will bring some of that controversy into play during the course of the debate. First of all, I think I should maybe begin with the non-controversial part of the bill, and that is the housing support grant element. Could I say that a cross-party group from the committee had the pleasure of visiting Shetland. As per usual, the population of Shetland provided us with an extremely warm welcome. And what I would say about Shetlanders are that they are extremely canny people indeed, and lobbied very hard for the retention of the grant. However, it has to be recognised that they are the last council that was in receipt of this grant, and their circumstances are somewhat strange in terms of the actual borrowing that they have made. As the Minister has pointed out, unlike most other authorities, it's not from the Public Works Loan Board that they have borrowed money from. It's from their own harbour fund. And canny as they are, the Harbour Fund has been charging them interest, and in some regards, the Housing Support Grant has been helping pay that interest to increase the Harbour Fund. I think the committee unanimously agreed that this could not go on, and recognised that the £15 million transitional fund that has been asked for also was not really a goer. However, I would say hats off to the Shetlanders for their lobbying efforts. So let's move from the area where we had complete agreement to the areas where there were some controversial parts. If I could deal with the housing element first, I think in terms of what the Minister has just said, the committee would welcome the element of £200 fine for not actually registering an empty property, going up to £500 as being in the right direction. And I think the committee will look at that again at stage 2. But we did feel, quite frankly, that £200 fine was not really that much in terms of actually not registering. We welcome the fact that there is local input in terms of setting rates, which I think that from somebody from a local government background always welcomes the flexibility in allowing our local councils to do these things. And also there was a huge debate round about whether or not there should be ring fencing of those monies to put back into housing, Again, from a local government background, I am not really in favour of ring fencing. However, I think that the committee fully endorsed the proposal to actually get back at a future date after this is implemented the actual accounts to show where that money has actually been spent. I think probably the longest part of my speech will go on the non-domestic rates element of the proposals, because this is the area where there was some disagreement within the committee. We certainly welcome the fact that industrial and listed buildings are exempt from the actual plan. And I certainly welcome the move that the Minister has made today in terms of saying that there may be a look at a relief element if you fill a property, because that was very much a topic for discussion in the committee itself. Now, a number of organisations appeared before the committee to argue that they thought that this was a bad thing. But no one likes new taxes, let's be honest with you. And if it's possible to try and stop a tax, you will do everything that you possibly can to do so. There was also elements of discussion in the debates that were held at committee about different things happening in different areas of the country. And I don't know if the Minister could actually have a look at some of that, because I think that that itself would be very beneficial indeed. The Minister rightly points out that this is an enabling power only, and that there is no plans at this moment to introduce it. And if there were, then what would have to happen is that it would come back to committee for further look-see in terms of the instrument that would need to be passed. And one of the reasons that the Minister has given for no bria is because that is the case, and there was some debate about whether that should have taken place beforehand, and I'm sure other members will pick up on that point as the debate progresses. In terms of the costs to public sector, if this is implemented, again, a very robust debate on that part of the bill. And the Minister has stated that the costs to the public sector would be some £1.8 million. We have heard from some others that may be up to £3.6 million, according to the Scottish Property Federation. But 1.8 million, 3.6 million, compared to the bill, the complete rates bill of 2.3 billion or so, I think that we need to take account of that situation. As I say, an extremely robust debate. There are many elements which I have not touched upon in my speech here today. I think that the committee itself at stage 2 will go over a number of these things again. I'm really pleased that the Minister is continuing to consult with stakeholders, because there was some criticism of a lack of consultation before by certain members of the committee. I am pleased today that he has said that he will look at the fine if you don't register an empty property. I think that that was a major element in discussion, and I hope that he certainly will look at some kind of relief in filling properties when amendments are actually lodged. I look forward to the future debate. I'm sure it's going to be as robust as the one that we have had at stage 1. I'm looking at colleagues as I am saying this. I actually enjoy the local government committee because people are very frank, but at the end of the day, we all come out still speaking to one another, or at least 99% of the time anyway. And I hope that we can do exactly the same when it comes to stage 2. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call on Sarah Boyack with around 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all welcome Margaret Burgess to her new post and wish her all the best for the future. We certainly look forward to debating a number of major issues with her in terms of providing new housing for Scotland. I also want to thank the three committees who conducted scrutiny on this bill. And I want to thank the clerks for their work and thank consultees for their evidence. I had a draft of my speech, actually, which thanked the Minister for his work. He may not be aware. The rumours flew round Holyrood yesterday that he was getting promotion. So we're interested to see him back at his desk. Can I come to the heart of this? From our perspective, although we agree with the objectives of trying to reduce the number of empty properties in both the business and the housing side, we do remain with serious concerns about the lack of rigour underpinning the SNP government's proposals. And I'll come back to the non-domestic rates proposals being announced without a formal consultation exercise. You can tell, reading through the representations, just how critical that was in terms of people looking at the bill, because it is such a short bill. There are so little details on the pages of these 3.5 pages that it's understandable that people are concerned. And today the Minister mentioned the criticism of the lack of a BRIA. And I believe that the Local Government and Regeneration Committee weren't given credible answers to their questions. Because from the Minister's perspective, and from John Swinney's perspective, I see he's gone, in the context of his huge budget, this may not look like a huge amount of money, but to all of the individual businesses who are deeply concerned that they will be affected, this is a life or death issue to them. So it is important, and we remain convinced that there should have been both a consultation and a BRIA conducted on these proposals. We remain of the view that it was unacceptable that it wasn't, because there remain many, many unanswered questions. On that point, yes.
Minister.
Thank the member for taking the intervention. I understand we have some time in hand. The question I'd like to pose, though, is it not better that rather than a short-term, few weeks piece of work on a consultation around what the bill and what the regulations could have looked like, that taking the time over the last number of months that we have to consult with stakeholders is exactly the kind of consultation engagement you would expect to see?
Sarah Boyack.
Well, my problem about that, Minister, is that you haven't actually formally reported to us what those conversations were. You've given us a selection of changes that you're intending to make at stage 2, but I still have not seen a written response to the committee's recommendations, and I think that's a fundamental part of the process of this Parliament. Had your comments this afternoon been a statement, we would have had an hour's notice to look over them, reflect on them, welcome some of them in detail, have a go at kicking you around the park and others. But without the lack of a formal written set of comments to the committee's recommendations, it's actually very difficult for us in a stage 1 debate on the principles, when the details in such a short bill are so fundamental. It's actually a very difficult issue for us to deal with. And the reason it's a fundamental issue is that once this bill goes through in terms of the principle tonight, as I imagine it will do, that means we open the amendment stage tonight. So from tonight we're able to put amendments, and we still don't have a record of the Scottish Government's views on the detailed recommendations made by committee. So I would ask, in your summing up, or immediately after tonight's debate, I would like you to give us a date by when you will actually have a written set of recommendations and your response to those recommendations. I think that is absolutely fundamental. I do welcome the fact that there have been discussions with stakeholders, but it's a partial representation we're getting here today. We are not able to see which stakeholders were included and which weren't. And business organisations in particular are deeply concerned about the negative impact this bill will create for them, given the economic downturn. In the debate we had, I do want to get on. The Welsh Assembly Government looked at the evidence of the NDR impact of the provisions that came into play in England, and they didn't go there. They took a very different approach to the business community. And I regret the fact that, as it stands, the bill enables the Minister to go full steam ahead after today's debate. We will be attempting to ensure at Stage 2 that the detailed concerns that were raised in relation both to the financial memorandum and the implementation of the bill are properly addressed at Stage 2. Because we've had a partial explanation of some of the changes the Minister wants to make today. It's not necessarily all the amendments the Minister will put forward. I think you would be assisting the democratic process greatly, not just in terms of us making our representations and drafting our amendments, but crucially for the business community external to this Parliament, so that we make sure that we have the maximum discussion at Stage 2 that I think Kevin Stewart was saying that was absolutely crucial. We are all looking forward to that debate. We need to be properly equipped to take part in that proposal. Businesses argue that properties are empty because of a lack of demand and that commercial properties are rarely left empty on purpose. And we have had evidence since the introduction of similar proposals in England that we've seen older buildings demolished rather than regenerated, and businesses have gone under. And the concern is that the proposals could further destabilise economic recovery. There are concerns that bank finance is still an issue, with potential pressure on property owners if they have to pay higher non-domestic rates without new rental income, while at the same time new tenants are still struggling to get finance. So how will ministers avoid increased levels of demolition? Because the worry is that in the current economic climate, we already have 14% of retail units lying empty, with many shops teetering on the brink as it is. And the Scottish Chambers of Commerce have suggested that this could lead to up to 40% units lying empty over the next 2 years. Now, the committee, I do need to make progress. The committee found it surprising that there was no attempt to estimate the number of commercial properties that will be brought back into use as a result of the bill's empty property leave proposals. And there was no evidence presented that reoccupation rates had increased in England as a result of increases to non-domestic rates. So there are issues about the detail, there are issues about the financial impact of the bill, not just on the public sector, but crucially on the business communities. But I do want to make clear some of the problems that have been raised by local government, because it's not just the business communities. Falkirk Council expressed concerns in the current adverse economic climate. They believe that the NDR proposals could further constrain redevelopment and regeneration, and they're worried about potentially unattractive gap sites emerging in retail locations with a negative impact on rental values as landlords seek to offload their liability by slashing rents. They also, I do need to make progress. Highland Council expressed concerns about absentee landlords, the volatility of the commercial property market, and the poor condition of many empty commercial properties. I think it's important that local authorities' concerns are brought to the Chamber today, because nobody has yet raised those concerns. There are also issues in relation to the empty homes provisions, where we think more detail is needed. Now, again, we support the ambition, and I certainly think that the comments from Shelter that we need a wider support for empty property owners to bring properties back into use is critical. And some of the measures that the Minister has referred to this afternoon, we will look at in detail, and I think will be helpful. But there's a key issue about the costs of implementation of the bill. And ministerial guidance, I believe, is going to be necessary to make sure that if this bill is going to be effective in relation to empty houses, that ministerial guidance is crucial, because it's not just a question of the statutory instrument. Will the Minister be bringing draft guidance before the Parliament? Will we see it before we debate the Stage 2? Will we see the detail of the statutory instruments before we debate the detail at Stage 2? I think without that, it will mean that the debate at Stage 2 will be very difficult to conduct, because we'll be conducting it without the knowledge of the detail that the Minister will be bringing forward thereafter. There were suggestions from the Waverley Housing Association of key measures which would help deliver the objectives of the bill. One issue not mentioned by the Minister today has been HAG funding. We know it's been slashed in the last year. RSLs need additional support if they're going to buy empty properties, to buy empty houses and bring them back so that you can refurbish them and rent them. Glasgow City expressed concern about the administrative costs of implementing the empty homes proposals, and they argued for enforced sale procedures to let them buy properties that were empty and bring them back into use. And Fife Council argued that there was real consideration needed in relation to the administration and the ability to collect the charges that will be levied. Their concern is that it will be very difficult to collect from some empty property owners. So those issues will need to be addressed at Stage 2. There are questions that are remaining outstanding, even after the the new comments that the Minister has put on the record this afternoon. I believe that we need to make sure that if we're to be effective as a Parliament, the Stage 2 process needs more information from the Minister before we launch into that. There are a couple of weeks left. I hope we will get a written response in detail to the responses that have been made. I reread the evidence again last night, and it's clear that there is support for the ambition of bringing empty properties back into use, but there is not agreement, and in fact there are deep worries that some of the elements in this bill will make matters worse. And the lack of a BRIA has added to that concern. So, moving into Stage 2, we will attempt to amend the bill. We will do our best to be constructive, as the Minister has encouraged us, but without the detailed knowledge in advance of going into that process, it is actually quite difficult for opposition parties to come up with detail on a bill that is such a short bill and such an enabling bill. Many respondents expressed their support for the principles, but the detail will be crucial. I do think the fact that 2 months after the official response from the committee, we don't have an official response from the government, that is a problem. We want to see the details. I hope the Minister will publish his response before Stage 2. That will mean that we have a meaningful Stage 2 process. Today is an opportunity for the Minister to answer more of the questions that were raised both at the Conservative debate in June and in the 3 committees that have reported thus far. I hope the Minister will take that opportunity in his summing up tonight.
Thank you. Can I just clarify, we do have time for interventions if members wish to take them, but it's entirely up to members whether they wish to do that. I now call on Margaret Mitchell with a flexible 6 minutes.
With a flexible
6 minutes, but very
flexible.
much,
Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to debate Stage 1 of the Local Government Finance and Unoccupied Properties Scotland Bill, which falls into 3 distinct categories, namely the reduction of rates relief on commercial empty properties, local authorities' discretionary powers to vary the council tax on unoccupied homes from the current minimum of 10% discount, and the abolition of the housing support grant. Can I begin by thanking all those witnesses who gave evidence to the committee and pay tribute to local government committee clerks for their work in producing the report, which, as the Vice-Convener indicated already this morning, was not an easy report to complete by virtue of the fact the committee was divided regarding the proposals for empty property and non-domestic rates relief, with the SNP members on one side and the rest of the committee on the other. This was the major and most contentious part of the bill, and the one on which I will focus the majority of my comments, and my colleague Alec Johnson will cover the other parts of the bill. In evidence sessions, the committee heard the legitimate concerns expressed by the CBI, the Federation of Small Business, the Scottish Chamber of Commerce, and a host of others, specifically on this aspect of the bill. These were exactly the same concerns the Finance Committee heard as the secondary committee scrutinising the financial implications of the bill. However, whilst the Finance Committee as a whole, including the SNP members, took this evidence on board and documented its concerns about aspects of the bill's provisions, such as the failure to take into account the cost of the policy will have on the public sector and its agencies, there was no correspondent dissent voiced by the local government SNP members in a moment. And this may well explain why the then local government convener Joe Fitzpatrick is now to be a minister and finance convener Kenny Gibson is sadly not.
Minister.
I think it's fair comment to say that some information on projections around costs, say, to the public sector wasn't provided at the stage to the Finance Committee, but was then provided to Local Government Committee, where those facts and figures were accepted and then allowed the debate to move on. I think Margaret Mitchell needs to move on as well.
Margaret Mitchell.
I think it's just indicative, Minister, of what a sloppy piece of work this was. The only mention was 12 government buildings and everything was fine. You seem to forget it impacted, or you didn't realise it impacted on the rest of the public sector. You didn't seem to realise it impacted on the rest of the public sector, Presiding Officer. The Government has a majority on all committees, and the SNP local government members used this to win the vote on each of the decisions on which the committee was split. And enforcing these proposals, the SNP members did win the day. But the question is, at what cost to the veracity and credibility of the committee system, which was once which once aspired to be the jewel in the crown of devolution? If you don't mind, I'll make some progress because I'm already almost halfway through my time more. There was no formal consultation on the non-domestic rate relief reform proposals, which will cost Scottish businesses millions of pounds each year and will affect thousands of properties and every public sector organisation. Now, the Minister asserted this was due to the scale of the issue, yet bizarrely, other parts of the bill were subject to formal consultation, including one aspect costing only $750,000, which currently only affects one council. This is not only inconsistent, it also defies logic. Nor did the Scottish Government undertake a business and regulatory impact assessment. In doing so, it defied its own guidelines, which state categorically that if a proposal imposes additional costs on businesses, then a BRIA is required, and that proportionality applies only to the size of the BRIA itself and has no bearing on the decision to undertake one in the first place. I think there will be ample opportunity for the Minister to come back on that. I'm short of time because I've still a bit to go. Well, I'm almost 5 minutes in, and it depends how long the presiding officer is
I can give you the time back if you wish to take interventions, but it's entirely up to yourself.
I think I'll wait till there's one on a more substantive point. Furthermore, the financial memorandum projected £18 million savings, which is totally unrealistic in anticipating a 100% collection rate, with no attempt made to assess how key assumptions may vary. Presiding Officer, this is a fundamentally flawed bill based on a false premise, namely that commercial property is empty through choice. The underlying reason for underlying reason for empty commercial properties is the lack of demand and the current economic climate, as those witnesses who gave evidence clearly and unambiguously stated. And by increasing the potential liabilities for those considering taking on unoccupied properties, the SNP is effectively smothering any prospect of attracting speculative development and tenancies. And this adversely impacts on regeneration, inward investment and economic growth. Presiding Officer, this bill will place additional burdens on already hard-pressed businesses, and the CBI's description of it as a tax on distress is accurate. It does precisely the opposite to its stated objective and will not get empty properties back into use. If you must.
Mark MacDonald.
Third time lucky, Presiding Officer. If the member considers that this scheme will be so damaging, why are her colleagues south of the border continuing with a less generous scheme in England?
Margaret Mitchell.
It always amazes me how they look at England and immediately want to copy what's done there. In actual fact, George Orderman is currently looking at the whole empty property rates relief, and we opposed it in the Parliament for good reason. It isn't an incentive, pure and simply. It was for this reason that it doesn't bring empty properties back into relief, as the objectives state, that I lodged my form of dissent to the committee report, which was supportive of the council tax and non-domestic rates provisions. And it is also why the Scottish Conservatives will be voting against the Stage 1 report this evening. Yet, sadly, it's a foregone conclusion that Stage 1 of the bill will be passed at decision time due to the SNP majority. Quite simply, this is the wrong proposal at the wrong time and should be abandoned before any lasting damage is done.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate and its speeches of a generous 6 minutes. Angus MacDonald to be followed by John Pentland.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Not being a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, can I say at the outset how pleased I am to be able to contribute to this debate. I'm sure every member in this chamber has alarm bells ringing when they see the number of empty commercial premises in their local town centres and district centres. And this bill, I believe, contrary to what we've heard from Labour and the Tories, will help to address the falling occupancy rates in all constituencies throughout Scotland, revitalising town centres and bringing up to 5,500 commercial properties and up to 25,000 long-term empty homes back into use. This bill effectively will tick the box that hopefully we all want to see ticked, and that is revitalised town centres with increasing footfall. Falkirk, which is the main town in my district, I'll get on for the time being, maybe later on. Falkirk, the main town in my district, has faced a number of commercial challenges over the past 3 or 4 years, not least falling footfall, as have other towns in my constituency, including Grangemouth and Bo'ness. This new bill will go some way towards addressing falling footfall in all our town centres, which is a concern to every retailer I've spoken to in my constituency over the past 3 to 4 years, and will, I'm sure, see a reverse in fortunes for our local retailers. It's therefore disappointing, Presiding Officer, that my local council have made a submission to the Local Government Committee, as referred to earlier by Sarah Boyack, objecting to the Scottish Government's proposal, despite the fact they acknowledge that, in the current economic climate, the key reason for the proliferation of empty retail premises is more likely to be the fundamental lack of occupier-tenant demand as a result of the continuing weakness of consumer confidence. This, while accurate to a degree, is not what I hear locally. I regularly hear of young entrepreneurs with sound business ideas who cannot move forward because they cannot afford to pay the rents on town and district centre shops. While they acknowledge the benefit of the small business bonus, the excessive rents are what puts them off moving their project forward at an early stage. Surely we should be encouraging budding entrepreneurs with a flair for business, not discouraging them, and this bill goes some way, albeit indirectly, towards addressing that. It's clear that under the current system, rents remain stubbornly high, and this bill will incentivise property owners to bring properties back into use. It will in turn assist budding entrepreneurs, many of whom will hopefully expand their enterprise over the years. In the town of Grangemouth in my constituency, there are currently 13 vacant retail premises, which represents a 15% vacancy rate. In Bo'ness, there's an 8.5% vacancy rate, although footfall in both these towns has fallen over the past 3 to 4 years, not solely down to the economic downturn, I must say. The introduction of supermarkets hasn't exactly helped. In Falkirk, and I'm sure my colleague Michael Matheson will forgive me for straying into his territory, as Falkirk's the main town in the district, however it is in the neighbouring constituency. There are currently some 60 ground floor retail properties vacant in the town centre, which as a percentage of the overall number of properties in the town equates to a 13% vacancy rate. We therefore cannot allow further increases in the vacancy figures and must do all that we can to reverse the current trend. It's heartening to note that in its submission to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee that the Association of Town Centre Managers Scotland stated their support for the principle of the legislation by agreeing that long-term vacant units are an issue which detract from town centres visually, having an especially acute effect on smaller centres, as can be seen in my constituency towns of Bo'ness and Grangemouth. The Association of Town Centre Managers go on to say they believe that action to address this issue is necessary, and changing the liability of property owners by decreasing the rate relief could be part of the solution. We have to ensure that such action galvanises stakeholders to work together to deliver occupancy by high-quality, long-term tenants. Now, there are, of course, some concerns that have been raised. The Association of Town Centre Managers again have highlighted that some institutional investors do not see vacancies as a priority, and this needs to change. For example, it has been particularly frustrating for me in my previous position as a Grangemouth councillor to see the regeneration of Grangemouth Town Centre stalled while 2 major property owners dispute the value of retail premises, resulting in delay after delay. Absolutely.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Mr MacDonald has highlighted the fact that some of the large business owners have stymied growth in some regards. Does he agree with the FSB who have said that only 2% of its members have benefited from small business rates relief, and 19% believed it had only 19% believed it had a positive effect on small businesses. I wonder how many of the large business owners would think that this had a positive effect for them. Probably the ones that are keeping property empty in his constituency.
Angus MacDonald.
Indeed, and the issue that we now have in Grangemouth is that the regeneration project has had to go back out to tender. Meanwhile, the property owners seem quite content to see their shops lying vacant. The Government, however, must avoid a situation, for example, where existing property owners could select safe bets that will produce long-term income streams regardless of the impact they will have on the wider town centre. There must also be some form of protection to ensure independent retail stores are not further eroded from our high streets and town centres, as we've seen in recent years, although this Scottish Government initiative could in effect encourage more independent retailers onto our high streets and into our district centres. Given the concerns that have been raised, however, it's encouraging to hear that the Scottish Government is still consulting and listening to stakeholders, so I'm sure many of the concerns raised will be addressed in the coming months as the bill proceeds to stage 2 and 3. It's also encouraging to hear that councils will have discretionary powers over empty property relief, and it is also encouraging to hear that the bill will ensure that every penny raised will go back to local government. Clearly, the other main plank of this bill is to address the issue of long-term empty homes. The bill will allow local authorities to increase council tax charges on certain long-term empty homes, which will help concentrate the minds of some landlords and property owners who up to now have paid little or no heed to the crying need for additional housing availability throughout Scotland, not least in my council area, where the Labour-controlled Falkirk Council has 9,500 households waiting on a council home. I therefore look forward to this bill progressing through Parliament with the end goal of more properties coming back into use in future years.
Many thanks. I now call John Pentland to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I know that communication with the Parliament isn't the Government's strong point, and I think the Minister has highlighted this in his opening remarks. But it would have been useful to have had a response to the committee's report from the Scottish Government before debating stage 1 of this bill, especially when the detail in the bill is so skimpy, mostly opening doors for the expansion of ministerial powers without making it clear how these powers will be used. More powers for ministers, criticism easily curtailed by committees packed with loyal supporters, and now this, not even responding to the committee before the principle of the bill is debated. You could be forgiven for thinking that the Scottish Government is intent on circumventing the Scottish Parliament, but we must be mindful that such situations, conspiracy is not the only option. You know, we have been promised a response before stage 2, but stage 2 amendments can be lodged when this debate finishes. Are they hoping to delay opposition amendments? Surely the Scottish Government should give reassurances, commitments, information.
Minister.
Assist the member, and I thank him for giving way. When I said as Minister that we would be listening to stakeholders and this Parliament, we meant it. And we are listening to this debate, which will further inform the stage 2 considerations and amendments. However, if you want clarity on when the response will be coming back to committees, we will ensure that the committees have the response and recommendations by early next week so it can inform stage 2.
John Pentland.
As Sarah Boyack had already said, this is stage 1 of the process, and this is where we should have had information, where we could have made a judgment on what has been debated here today. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. We have promised a response before... so are they hoping for a delay in opposition amendments? Surely the Scottish Government, should give reassurances, commitments and information now to shed light on some of the darker recesses of this legislation and thus facilitate the submission of amendments. The issues raised in the committee deserve a response, including those that were knocked back by the firewall of loyal backbenchers. The reluctance to be critical meant that we couldn't be clear about the lack of clarity in the policy memorandum, only that... No, I'm not going to take an intervention, Kevin, Mr Stewart, because I'm here to represent my constituents, not to help the aspirations or ambitions of those people who may want to be a minister. Only that it may be lacking. And despite the acknowledgement that assumptions were based on unknown quantities or potential variations, it wasn't acceptable to describe them as speculative. Likewise, noting several witnesses had dared to question whether the bill would generate the resources claimed by ministers was simply going too far. On the plus side, ministerial assurances that local authorities have discretion about using the new powers is welcome, tacitly acknowledging that they won't be to everybody's benefit, albeit that this is not acknowledged in the revenue calculations. The shoddiness of the financial assertions is matched by the scantiness of the business consultation. Both could have been addressed through a BRIA. No, because I think you have aspirations too.
Through the chair, please.
Sorry, Presiding Officer.
Mr Pentland, please continue. Order.
Sorry. The cost and extent. No. I need to progress. The cost and extent of this would be proportionate. That is small compared to the anticipated revenues from the scheme. If the Scottish Government is confident that its calculations and guesstimates are sound, they should have no fear of undertaking a BRIA. Conversely, the refusal to do so can be taken as an indication of their lack of confidence in their own case of this bill. On the issue of the Finance Committee report, the criticisms were grudgingly noted by a local government committee rather than accepted, and the lack of clarity and margins of uncertainty in the financial memorandum were judged unfortunate rather than unsatisfactory. Unfortunately, I still don't find such failings satisfactory. The financial assertions behind this bill show great imagination. They have been defended as potential maximum amounts, but are based on factors that are unlikely to deliver anything approaching those amounts. Does that matter? It matters if the money has been spent before it was raised and has to be raised elsewhere. It matters if the cost of raising money outweigh the good that is done with the money. And it matters if people go out of business or properties are demolished. These are not the intended consequences of the bill. I accept that the Government has brought the bill forward in good faith, and as the committee somewhat unnecessarily asserts, is the bill fit for purpose? Though flawed, it can be amended to address the blight of unoccupied properties without inflicting greater harm elsewhere. If it brings people and businesses into unoccupied properties, then surely making money should be secondary, not the driver, and it may even be counterproductive. And a lot of the evidence to the committee made just that point. I would be a lot happier about allowing it to go forward if the issue of the lack of consultation highlighted by the committee was addressed through a BRIA. This should happen as soon as possible, and invite the Minister to reconsider. Initially, I had a level of enthusiasm and optimism about this bill. So it is difficult to argue against the bill's intentions to address unoccupied properties. However, as the bill stands, I believe it could do more harm than good, but I'm prepared to consider improvements, and on that basis, I'm supporting it today.
Thank you. I now call John Mason to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Clearly, the starting point here is that we have empty houses and we have empty business premises which are sitting there unused, while at the same time we have individuals and families going homeless and we have businesses unable to get hold of affordable properties. Something is inherently wrong, the market is not working, and the challenge is how can we get more of these empty properties into use? Now, no one's saying there's an easy answer to this problem, and already seen that the Government is taking on board suggestions that have been made. But if some today are going to oppose these proposals, then I hope they will tell us what the alternative proposals are that they have. Touching first on council tax relief, on the housing front, we have a clear shortage of several types of housing in the East End of Glasgow. Yet I have twice seen over the years flats in my own close where I live sitting empty for over a year. There can be a variety of reasons for this, and it has been suggested we need to do more studies on the subject. But the fact remains that some owners may let things drift, and incentive of escaping council tax might encourage them to sell. I do like the fact that this move is empowering local government. Under the previous administration at Holyrood, there was the repeated tendency to centralise, whereas under this administration, ring fencing has been largely ended, and moves like this power strengthen the power of local government. I particularly too like the idea that different areas can be treated differently by one council. Despite what some members may think, Glasgow is a very varied city, and the east and the west of the city are quite different, face different challenges and require different solutions. Moving on to non-domestic rates, on commercial and retail properties, of course there's likely to be more of an issue for debate today. And there is clearly a different issue when property prices are rising than when they are falling. One example while prices were rising was the old post office building in George Square, which members may be familiar with. While I was a councillor, it sat empty for several years and was used by the owner as basically an advertising hoarding, and members may remember the huge advert which appeared facing onto George Square. And the only real power the council had when it was totally fed up with the owner was to stop the advertising. So to try to bring that property back into use, which was blighting the city centre for so long, this kind of power is exactly what is needed. Any move to encourage property owners to bring properties into use is to be welcomed, especially before properties start rising again, as we certainly hope they will. Now, the Finance Committee spent a fair bit of time on the financial memorandum, and the report runs to some 45 pages. It's worth saying that the work was carried out in May, and some of the points and questions raised then have already been dealt with by the main committee or by government. I note, for example, in paragraph 187 in the main committee's recommendations that it itself noted that the Finance Committee had to do a fair bit of digging to get into the detail. But I think these points referred to have now largely been resolved. I think it was a robust report, as I think Margaret Mitchell agreed, and I think it is a good example of a committee in this Parliament being prepared to question and challenge government on areas where it was not satisfied. We took evidence from a number of bodies, including the Business Centre Association and Scottish Property Federation, and comparisons were made with the English experience in recent years. But the evidence around this did tend to be rather weak. For example, it was noted that retail vacancy rates in England had risen from 3% in 2007 to 14% in 2011. However, it was not possible to say how much of this was the result of the recession. Evidence was not produced to support that, and how much was linked to the empty property relief changes. It is possible that the vacancy rates of 14% would be even higher, but for the changes that were introduced. And in this regard, as has been said, our proposed system is much more generous to businesses than in England, and I believe the Conservative government, despite what Margaret Mitchell says, has no plans to change the system in England. Yes, I'm happy to take an intervention.
Michael McMahon.
In pursuit of the evidence that he and I saw on the Finance Committee, does he not agree, still agree with the findings of the Finance Committee that some of that evidence could have been produced had we had a BRIA?
Yes, well, I'm just moving on to that. So I do stand by the report of the Finance Committee, which I think has been widely accepted as robust. First of all, if I can touch on consultation, I think the committee struggled to understand why there was more detailed consultation on the council tax proposals than on non-domestic rates. Yes, we accepted that consultation was included in the budget process. However, it was somewhat swamped there by other budget issues and might have benefited from being highlighted more in its own right. This point, I'm glad to see, has been taken on board by the main committee in paragraphs 114 to 120. I certainly do accept that there has since been a robust debate both in the main committee and the Finance Committee, so probably, in fact, we are currently in the same position where we would have been if there had been consultation at an earlier stage. Moving on to the business and regulatory impact assessment, which Mr McMahon has raised, again, we spent a fair bit of time considering whether this was required or not. I think we did accept as a committee that £18 million was not a huge amount, in the bigger scheme of things. However, our understanding was that a BRIA would be required, according to government guidance, even for a small impact, and it would be the scale of the BRIA which would be reduced accordingly. I'm grateful to the main committee for taking this point seriously, and I was rereading this morning the report in paragraphs 121 to 130 that they pressed the Minister on this point. And I do think their final paragraph in paragraph 130 is a fair conclusion to reach. It says the committee welcomes the Minister's commitment, stated above, to explore and refine the policy and to listen to the committee and to stakeholders. And then the committee therefore urges the Scottish Government to continue the dialogue with business organisations and other stakeholders as the policy develops. That seems fair to me. Yes, on you go.
Hanzala Malik.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Angus MacDonald made a very good point in regards to small businesses and how they need to be protected up and down Scotland, and particularly Glasgow, the type of city it is. I'm just wondering, has anybody actually consulted the small businesses independent rather than the big unions?
John Mason.
I think the Finance Committee had comments from both organisations representing small businesses and larger businesses. But I think the point we're making here is that, yes, a lot of us would have liked more consultation at an earlier stage, but that consultation has now effectively happened because there has been so much coverage of this. And I'm sure the Minister is still listening. I'm certainly convinced that he's still listening as we move forward. So, okay.
Kevin Stewart.
My earlier remarks about small business and the FSB quite clearly shows that only 2% of FSB members said that they benefited from empty property relief, and only 19% of their members believed it had a positive effect on small businesses. I think that small business, certainly in my area, and I think probably in Glasgow too, Presiding Officer, do not see a huge benefit from this, but what they see is a huge benefit going to the bigger boys.
John Mason, I'd be grateful if you could draw to some conclusion, please.
Yes, well, I take on board absolutely what Kevin Stewart says. So in conclusion, I think my final remarks would just be that we're still at an early stage with this bill. The Government has made it very clear that it has listened and is listening to business and other stakeholders, and therefore I'm happy to support this bill at this stage. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Anne McTaggart to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And before I begin, I welcome Margaret Burgess to the front bench and to her new role, of which I know that she'll be a huge asset. Before I begin, I also want to wish to declare that I am a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, which reported on the Local Government Finance Unoccupied-Properties Scotland Bill. At present, there are over 100,000 empty buildings and homes in Scotland, contributing to our housing crisis and marring our town centres. While we all want to see empty properties brought back into use, there are flaws in this bill which the Scottish Government must address before passing this legislation. The principles displayed by the Government in their introduction of this bill are of merit. There is good work being undertaken by the Scottish Government in partnership with the Shelter Scotland through the introduction of the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership Scheme, of which we've heard from other members also. However, it is the legislation regarding the non-domestic rates which is problematic and must urgently be reconsidered by the Scottish Government. It is this part of the legislation that I wish to focus on. As the bill stands, the Government has failed in its duty to look at the financial and economic implications of this legislation. No one wants to see unoccupied properties scarring our high streets and town centres. However, this is legislation brought in at the wrong time. Glasgow City Council, in its evidence submitted to the Local Government Committee, stated that under this bill they would be forced to demolish buildings they would have otherwise held on to as part of their long-term regeneration strategy. The Scottish Government ascertains that the introduction of this legislation would raise savings of £18 million. However, I would dispute that figure, as the Scottish Government has not taken into account the cost of collecting rates on its own empty properties, a figure which could total as much as £1.8 million. Estimates by the Scottish Property Federation predict that at least 20% of these forecasted savings would be met by the public purse, with hospitals and government offices footing the bill. Certainly.
Check Roddy.
I just wonder, I mean, not for me to, after all the years of Labour financial management or mismanagement, afford them one oasis in the basis of that desert of incompetence. But, you know, that in 2007, Labour took a fairly intensive analysis, consultation through the Barker Review, the Lyons Inquiry, etc. And indeed, that Master of Economics, Gordon Brown, said that commercial property lying empty should not continue to be given generous business rate relief, particularly because this leads to higher rents in areas with highest demand. Do you agree with his statement or not?
Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Mr Brodie. This was before the recession. If you forgot to add that slight part into it. And unlike the Scottish ministers, the Labour ministers took financial due diligence. Nor has it thought about the impact of such legislation on local government. It is estimated that this legislation will cost Glasgow City Council alone as much as £1 million. An extra levy at a time when local government is struggling to meet the financial demands placed on it. We have, as an opposition, been vocal on changes that need to occur in the legislation. It was only 3 months ago that I, along with CBI, called on the Minister to complete a BRIA assessment as a way of strengthening the financial competency of the bill. However, the Government still refuses to take these steps. Presiding Officer, as we know, the Scottish Government has been aware of financial question marks hanging over this bill for some time. Before the bill was brought to the attention of the Local Government Committee, it was slated by the Finance Committee for its poor attention to detail, and they could not support the financial memorandum of this bill. This bill, Presiding Officer, is salvageable. However, before Stage 2 is completed, I urge the Government to look again at the issue of the non-domestic rates to ensure it is not penalising small businesses or hindering the economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The American satirist Stephen Colbert once said of President George W. Bush that he was a man who believed the same thing on Wednesday that he did on Monday, irrespective of what happened on the Tuesday. And I think when we listen to the speeches being made by the opposition parties, that's a maxim that seems to apply in relation to this legislation, because this legislation is a very different beast to that which appeared at the Finance Committee with its financial memorandum. And the Minister has been in listening mode throughout that period and has made it quite clear today that he has been in listening mode. And over the last 2 days, opposition members have stood up in this chamber during the course of the legislative programme and told us that this is a government that doesn't listen, that it simply uses its majority to steamroll things through. And yet, the Minister has come to the chamber today and told Parliament that he has been listening to stakeholders and that he is open to listening to constructive suggestions. I was interested in Sarah Boyack's contribution because, from what I could gather, she was simultaneously arguing against the measures to achieve savings via the non-domestic rates proposals contained within the legislation, while at the same time suggesting that what the government should be doing is increasing funding for things such as the HAG. Now, you simply cannot argue for the government to spend more money without giving an indication as to where that money would come from. It's a discussion that we had over the course of yesterday afternoon with her colleague Ken McIntosh. And it was suggested at that time that perhaps Mr McIntosh has found a magical money tree in East Renfrewshire and where that he could take us there. Perhaps he has revealed it to Sarah Boyack and told her where it is, and maybe she will take the opportunity now to tell us the location of this tree which the government could harvest to spend on the priorities Labour wants to spend more money on.
Sarah Boyack.
2 points, Mr MacDonald. First, our problem is about the lack of rigour and lack of confidence we have in the figures that underpin this bill, which is exactly the same as the day it was introduced. It's the Minister's intentions that are changing. The page we have in front of us has not changed. And secondly, I was quoting from the Waverley Housing Association and asking for the Minister to address the points that they had made. That is the bit we need, the Minister to respond to the points that have been made through this process.
Mark MacDonald.
It's interesting that whenever Labour members are challenged around their wish to spend more money, they say, it is not us, it is other people who are asking to spend more money. We are simply bringing those points to the chamber, de facto arguing yourselves for more money to be spent in areas, while at the same time giving no indication of where you would make reductions in order to fund that consequential increase in funding. That is not constructive opposition. I say to Margaret Mitchell, the last people I will take any lectures from on issues to do with housing are Conservative members. If the Tories had their way, they would have carried on selling off council homes, squeezing low-income families out of the housing market and out of the possibility of accessing social housing. If we look at the lists, 9,500 households in Falkirk waiting on a council home, 8,000 households in Aberdeen waiting on a council home, 6,297 households classed as homeless in Glasgow, 16,714 households in Fife waiting on a council home. That is the legacy of Thatcherism. That is the legacy of what the Conservatives would be doing with council housing and with social housing in Scotland. And it's it's fantastic that we are able to protect Scottish social housing from the Conservatives, were that we could be protecting other areas of Scotland from the Conservatives. Well, Margaret Mitchell made me wait, so I will make her wait slightly longer before she gets to intervene on my speech. There are claims that we are looking to England and simply copying. We're looking at what the Labour Party implemented and the Tories are continuing and simply copying it. That is simply not true. The measures which are being put forward here are an improvement on the measures which are being implemented down south. That is why the government here has looked at the lessons that were learned from down south and excluded, for example, industrial units because of the impact that the measures down south had on industrial units. That is why we will continue to offer the most generous relief package in the whole of the United Kingdom, because we have looked at the examples from elsewhere and looked at how those examples could be refined and improved. And I will now allow Margaret Mitchell to make her intervention.
Margaret Mitchell.
Yeah, I'm grateful to the member for taking intervention. I wonder if he's aware of the R. Lambert-Smith-Hampton report from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. They published it, making it quite clear that it wasn't just industrial properties that were demolished, all types. So where's the raison d'etre for merely exempting industrial properties?
Mark MacDonald.
Well, I'm freely willing to admit that I have not read the report in question. However, I have had evidence being given at committee that it was industrial properties that were the big question mark from those organisations who had come before us with their concerns. And we're told that the UK government, the Tory UK government, doesn't think this is a good idea and doesn't want to continue with it. Well, that's an interesting perspective from Margaret Mitchell. Robert Neal, Junior Minister for Communities and Local Government, at least he was at the time that I found the quote, I don't know what happened with him in the reshuffle, has stated the Coalition have no immediate plans to reverse the reforms. So they are continuing with the policy south of the border. Now, I'm pleased that the Minister responded constructively to my suggestion that he look to the Northern Ireland incentive package, where relief is given at the point of a property being filled, because I believe that it is important that there is some form of incentivisation contained within this package as well. And I'm pleased that the Minister has taken that on board and is proactively looking to see whether that can be incorporated at stage 2. I will be interested to see that coming forward. I hope it will form part of the government's amendment package at stage 2. And it's interesting what happens when one tries to be constructive and offer alternative proposals. Perhaps some of the opposition members might wish to reflect upon that, because we've heard scant little from them about how they would see this bill being reformed or made to work better. Indeed, we heard Anne McTaggart telling us that she believed that this bill was salvageable, but in no way has she told us what she sees as the key changes that need to be made. She's told us what her concerns are. I understand she's told us what her concerns are, but she hasn't told us what changes would need to be made in order to satisfy her concerns, and she needs to do that in order for the Minister to take that on board. Well, I will look forward to the amendments that are brought forward by Labour members at stage 2. But it was bemoaned by some opposition members about how life was better in the last session because apparently the government listened more. We have a minister here who is stating quite clearly that he's listening. It's up to the opposition parties to start saying things which are actually occasionally constructive and at the same time worth listening to.
Thank you. I now call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am not a member of one of the committees that has scrutinised this legislation or had the privilege of listening to witnesses on it. What I intend to do is confine my comments to evidence that I've gathered myself from the area that I represent in terms of stakeholders who have an interest in urban regeneration. I represent the south of Scotland, and as we know, the problem of empty properties is worse in rural areas, and it's nothing short of tragic to see otherwise handsome market towns spoiled by abandoned shop fronts that ooze a sense of neglect, and I would hope that everyone in this chamber is agreed on that point. In Dumfries and Galloway, the number of long-term empty properties has risen from 695 in 2008 to 823 last year, and the percentage of long-term empty properties in the region is above the Scottish average. In terms of the views that I've gathered from officials in economic development, regeneration, housing and planning, I have to say they all welcomed this proposal in general. Nobody is pretending, of course, that the bill will eradicate the blight on its own. Rather, it's viewed among the stakeholders I spoke to as a welcome addition to the regeneration toolbox, which includes other Scottish initiatives such as the Shelter Run Scottish Empty Homes Partnership and, of course, the Small Business Bonus, which benefits so many small retail owners, and, of course, the Town Centre Regeneration Fund. In Dumfries and Galloway, for example, the local authority has already used existing powers to reduce council tax discount on empty properties and second homes, and as a result is generated $900,000 a year to invest in affordable housing. This bill increases such powers and is therefore an extension of something that has been proven to work. In terms of town centre regeneration, I'm told that improvements such as streetscaping and community involvement are hampered in the area being improved if it's marred by empty properties. So without the levers this bill will provide, the main power available to local authorities, according to the people I've spoken to, is enforcement. For example, if a number of properties are lying empty and neglected, legal intervention is an option, but I've been told it's a costly and time-consuming option, and that's why the measures introduced in this bill are being welcomed. This proposal is, of course, designed to incentivise owners in returning properties to positive use. And one senior economic development professional pointed out to me this might encourage some lateral thinking on the from the point of view of landowners. A landowner might have to consider a change of use. For example, a retail unit that's no longer viable for that purpose may be suitable for community use. The same official also hoped that the change in legislation might encourage rental charges to be lowered, and so incentivising new business start-ups, a point that's already been made by my colleague Mr MacDonald. The bill seeks to take into consideration the concerns of local property owners, small business owners who are simply struggling to cope with the recession, and the Minister has already indicated some of the measures that he's planning to take. And my colleague Mr Stewart here has pointed out that the Federation of Small Business say that very few of their members, only 2%, have actually benefited from the empty property relief. However, the stakeholders I spoke to in economic regeneration were very keen to point out that the biggest issue for them was absentee ownership, where properties are part of a wider investment portfolio. This is particularly the case with larger properties that may have been rented by large retail chains. For example, the former Woolworths chain springs to mind. Often local authorities, I am told, find it difficult to have any meaningful dialogue with such faceless owners other than through property agents. The harsh truth is, Presiding Officer, that these agents are primarily interested in financial return and spend little or no time considering their wider responsibilities to communities in which they have very little stake. Affecting their bottom line is the only way to make them sit up and listen, and that's why I welcome this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Before I call Jim Hume to be followed by David Torrance, I just draw to members' attention that we've quite a considerable amount of time in hand. So for any of you who wish to speak a little longer than your 6 minutes, that would certainly be welcome today. Mr Hume, a very generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, a very generous Presiding Officer. And also I would like to welcome Margaret Burgess to her new ministerial position and look forward to working with her to help housing position in Scotland. And there is little doubt that we need to address the problem of homelessness with some 335,000 households on housing association and cooperative waiting lists. And depending on which facts you take, we've had 20 to 100,000, but the figures I have is 120,000 households being on
council waiting lists for some time. So there's little doubt that we need to help also businesses grow in Scotland and, yes, get more commercial properties into full use. But is hitting them with higher business rates the right thing to do when they're unable to let out their commercial properties? I don't think so. And neither does the Scottish Chamber of Commerce. They stated that it could risk businesses letting commercial properties to even pulling down the properties that they may be having difficulty to let. And let's face it, it's in their interest to let out their properties, not at all in their interest to let them lie vacant with running costs being liable to them, so we need commercial property developed in Scotland to help with regeneration. We don't need barriers to that, and I believe in hammering empty commercial properties a barrier. Yes, of course, Minister.
Derek Mackay.
We've heard from the Conservatives that they're willing to continue with the policy in England. Is that the same position for the Liberal Democrats that are also continuing with it in England as well?
Well, I'll come to that point in just a second. It's the second paragraph coming along. But our Parliament's own Finance Committee had concerns too. They reckoned that up to 870 council properties could be affected, and that could have a negative impact of, we've heard today, between 1.8 to 3.6 million a year to the public purse. Therefore, this government, I think, needs to balance its decision-making between revenue raising and, of course, regeneration. And I would think in these times the focus should be on maximising regeneration, not hindering. And it's not just the Chamber of Commerce and our Parliament's committee who has concerns. In England, Labour brought in a similar measure in their last years of power, obviously a last desperate act to grab money from businesses to plug the hole in their wall of debt. And there it has been counterproductive. Vince Cable himself has called it economically damaging and not productive. Empty commercial properties have risen by nearly 15% there since that change south of the border by Labour. Only if the member has no aspirations and it's substantive.
Mark MacDonald.
I aspire only to extract the truth from Mr Hume, Presiding Officer. Perhaps Mr Hume would explain then, if the government views it simply as revenue raising by the Labour government, why they have reduced the threshold at which exemptions kick in terms of the rateable value.
Jim Hume.
I think that's a fair point, but I'll carry on if you don't mind. Evidence north of the border is less than scarce. We haven't had any evidence from the Minister to this point. The government to date has shown no proof that hitting businesses with higher taxes on empty properties would bring any commercial properties back into use. As was pointed out by the Finance Committee convener, the financial memorandum even uses the word hope. How can a government propose legislation based on the hope that it will help? Not only is this unfair on the businesses, but it's a waste of time if it's not successful. The government says that their changes to empty commercial property relief would discourage property owners from leaving their businesses empty. Why on earth would they leave them empty when it's in their financial interest to let them out so that some other business can pay their rates, so that another business can pay the necessary maintenance costs of heating, light and often security, and then that they can actually make some money from that rental income? So this proposal in this bill today is purely about an attempt to raise money from the business sector who can ill afford it at this time. I, along with FSB and CBI, implore a serious review of the empty properties rates relief scheme before this bill is even considered being passed. Turning to the proposal to abolish housing support grant, we haven't heard too much from other members about that. And I know this would only affect Shetland, but there is a historic reason for that. Shetland's housing debt arose from the need to build houses following the construction of the Sullom Voe oil terminal in the 70s. The population increased by 40%. Therefore, over some 20 years, that very small council had to build 200 to 300 houses, causing debts of around £50 million. There's no way that a small council could balance its housing revenue account without serious knock-on effects, albeit perhaps unintended but real, of increased rents and cuts in maintenance. The Shetland Council has been adamant that if the housing support grant has to go, then transitional arrangements need to be in place, a point agreed by this Parliament's committee. To date, there's been no sign of any such arrangements from this government, and no words today of that either. In fact, the very opposite. Shetland is in... Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Jean Urquhart.
Will you acknowledge that the time of the development at Sullivvoe and the need for these houses in Shetland, this arrangement was made with the Westminster Government, which only recently itself stopped paying the support grant to the Scottish Government?
Shetland's an anomaly regarding housing support. It's not a massive amount we're talking about. We're talking about some £750,000 in this next year. And all public money must be totally scrutinised. It must for effective use. But this is a huge amount for a small council. And let's not forget the reason for this support. It's due to the success of the oil industry in Shetland and the North, an industry that this government often looks on with green eyes. Presiding Officer, the Liberal Democrats have too many concerns in supporting this bill at this stage and shall be voting so at decision time today. We need to support businesses and communities in these times, not hinder and hammer them.
Thank you very much. I now call on David Torrance to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm, and as you will see, there's plenty of time for interventions.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This bill addresses quite some critical issues. Reviving town centres is crucial as they lie at the heart of many communities and reflect economic growth. Bringing up to 5,500 properties back into use in Scotland's town centres will generate a greater feeling of optimism. They will become more attractive again, more readily accessible to those people who do not have means to get out of town to shopping hubs, and will also create new jobs. This resurgence will benefit towns and communities.
Margaret Mitchell.
That figure that he quoted of 550,000 is the number of empty properties, not the number that assumes 100% will all come back into use. Could he give us a figure that's been estimated, as the Minister hasn't been able to do it, that will actually be brought into use as a result of this incentive?
David Torrance.
We can all hope that they all will be brought into. Developers are there and property owners to use these properties. And if we could bring incentives to make them all go, like in Kirkcaldy, where we have a number of properties which have been vacant for 10 to 15 years, and there's been no incentive for the developers or the property owners to bring them back into use in our high street. Communities and many other aspects as well. Scotland is in urgent need of more housing, and at the same time, 25,000 houses in Scotland are empty long term. There are undoubtedly many different reasons for these vacancies. Nevertheless, we need to bring these homes back into the market to help alleviate the shortages in housing. At a time when the UK Government is cutting Scotland's budget year by year, subsidising vacant commercial properties by over £150 million a year does not seem like responsible use of taxpayers' money. Owners need not be scared, though. Despite the limited resources, empty property relief will still be more advantageous in England and Wales. The Government needs to be able to make regulation to alter non-domestic rates regimes by varying the rates of relief available for certain empty commercial properties, to alter the level of council tax relief available, similarly the level of council tax payable on long-term empty homes. At the moment, all empty non-domestic properties are entitled to 100% rate relief for the first 3 months, followed by a 50% discount on the rates until property is occupied for up to 6 weeks. With the proposed bill, the rates relief for all non-domestic properties will reduce to 10% after 3 months. Exemptions for listed, industrial or properties with lower value will remain. Subsidising currently around 19,000 properties with over £150 million a year in empty property rates doesn't seem like a fair sharing of the burden. And it is the biggest type of business relief in Scotland. More than the small business bonus scheme that assists businesses to actively contribute to our society and our economy. Reducing the relief for around 6,500 properties currently receiving 50% relief to 10% will reduce the cost to the public by an estimated £18 million a year. To tackle a huge number of long-term empty homes in Scotland, the Scottish Government needs to be able to make regulations to alter council tax discount if a property remains empty. Such regulations still give an exemption for the first 6 months and then only continues for another year if the owners are actively trying to sell their home. Followed by the ability for local authorities to reduce discounts to 0%, local authorities would set rates, decide what constitutes actively try to sell, and if additional exemption periods would be appropriate. With the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, run by Shelter Scotland, that supports local authorities, private owners and others, and with a consultation on council tax changes to long-term unoccupied properties that runs until the 5th of October, the Scottish Government is already working actively to reduce the number of empty homes. Those councils who choose to charge a council tax increase for empty homes will also offer advice and support. Proposed measures in the consultation on the new council tax regulation, which allows council to impose an increase of up to 100% of relevant council tax for homes that have been empty for at least 1 year, to offer 10 to 50% discounts for unfurnished properties empty between half a year and a year rather than a 50% discount, to apply different rates of discount or increase council tax in different parts of their area, or to increase rates the longer a home has been empty. These measures will be beneficial in generating much-needed additional revenue for council, while simultaneously reducing the number of empty and much-needed homes in Scotland. The benefits of the bill are self-evident. The empty property rates reform will bring up to 5,500 properties back into use, and with this kick-start the revitalisation of town centres, essential towards achieving a sustainable future. So strong and vibrant town centres and business districts are crucial to the economic and social fabric of Scotland. The change to council tax relief for long-term empty homes should bear the potential to drastically reduce the number whilst providing much-needed homes. The Government is aware of the necessity to take other factors into consideration, and integral parts of the proposed bill allow for different circumstances. It will encourage owners of property, whether for domestic use or commercial, that in long term it will be more advantageous finally and for the good of the community to maximise their potential by ensuring that all properties are being used appropriately. The Government will continue to listen to stakeholders from the private sector regarding their concerns, give the opportunity to engage in the process prior to regulations being introduced, and invites all stakeholders and members of this Parliament to contribute in this. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Nigel Donne.
Can I start by welcoming Margaret Burgess to her new position as Minister-designate, I should say, for Housing and Welfare, and wish her all the best in that very important role. Can I also welcome half of the bill before us today, since this is basically a bill of two halves, the Housing Support Grant section, the Housing Support Grant having long since withered on the vine everywhere in Scotland except Shetland. The good half relates to council tax and empty homes, extending the action that was taken by the previous government in 2003 in order to help deal with the serious problem of 25,000 long-term empty homes. In this half of the bill, the Minister was also in listening mode, and I welcome the announcement that he made about increasing the penalty to £500, so incentivised to make it worthwhile councils taking action in this area. There are certainly issues about exemptions from the new regime, and in fact I've raised issues about exemptions from the 2003 regime with the Council. That was the regime which reduced the discount to 10% for empty homes. On exemptions, however, I do agree with what Shelter said in evidence on the 16th of May, and perhaps, given the time we have, I can read a couple of sentences of that, because I think it is quite important. 16th of May, at column 969, we warn against having too many exemptions that are subjective, because that makes the system more expensive to enforce. We would like the balance to be on the other side, where someone who is in genuine hardship and is doing everything that they can to bring the property back into use is given incentives and financial help from the Council using money that has been recycled from the levy. Now, some of the actions being taken by the Government in relation to empty homes were mentioned by the Minister, but I think more is needed, and I think some of that is highlighted in that quotation from Shelter, and there's many more suggestions from the written submission from Shelter, and I would urge the Minister to look at that and perhaps focus on this issue of empty homes as her first action as Housing Minister. And if she wants a precedent for that, my first announcement as Housing Minister in May 1997 was an empty homes initiative with some money attached, and it was inspired, I can reveal for the first time, by Shelter. So, moving on to non-domestic rates. Yes,
Kevin Stewart.
Because at the committee itself, the then Minister for Transport and Housing quite clearly stated the issues will take time to work through. If it was clear that a sincere effort had been made to sell or let a property, for example, we would not want to punish somebody for a genuine attempt to bring an empty home into productive use.
From that, members will realise that, like Joan McAlpin, I wasn't on either of the committees dealing with this bill, so if I'm not fully conversant with all the details, I'm sure members will forgive me, which is perhaps not the best way to introduce the bad half of the bill, but the non-domestic rates part can certainly be described in that way. And I didn't hear any improvements announced by the Minister today, although I note that Mark MacDonald was referring to listening mode for all parts of the bill. So again, if I've missed something, I'm sure someone will correct me. It seemed to me that even the Minister was a bit defensive about this, because the first thing he said about the non-domestic rates section was that it was only an enabling power. And again, Kevin Stewart can correct me, but I thought Kevin Stewart said that he thought there were no plans to actually bring it into action. So I think that needs to be clarified, although I did personally think the Minister said, yes, I give way again.
Kevin Stewart.
There's nothing in this bill at this moment to bring it into action. An enabling power is an enabling power. And if the government chooses to use that power at a later date, as I said in my speech, that will have to come back to committee.
Indeed, that's the case. But I do think we do need this to be clarified. And to be fair to the Minister, I do think I recall him saying that he intended to introduce regulations in 2013, but perhaps that can be clarified in the summing up. Now, I think the committees, yes, I give way.
If it's of assistance, this bill creates enabling power, which I would have to have passed, returned to Parliament with the regulations on how varying rates relief would look like. So all the regulations would change the actual rates relief that people enjoy. This bill gives us the enabling power to achieve that. Our stated position was that what we proposed at the budget was outlined, and I have been consulting on that with members and stakeholders since then, hence the suggestion around Northern Ireland as well. But I'd have to return to that by way of regulations as a statutory instrument.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification, if such it be. Now, the committees were, in fact, I note, quite critical, especially the Finance Committee, but even the Local Government Committee criticised the government for lack of consultation on this section of the bill, and indeed the inadequacies of the financial memorandum. The Minister said in his speech today that no business and regulatory impact assessment was necessary because of the small number of properties affected, but the Finance Committee pointed out that it could potentially affect all businesses which use commercial properties. That committee concluded that the bill's proposals may impact detrimentally both on individual businesses and the broader economy, and that's a quote from the report. And the committee also pointed out that there was no evidence that reoccupation rates in England had increased. So this is not evidence-based policy. It seems to be policy without evidence in regard to this very important part of the bill. Indeed, the evidence from England, which Sarah Boyack referred to, is about older buildings getting demolished. And indeed, as Jim Hume pointed out, it seems that even more of them are actually becoming empty. Such evidence as we do have from Scotland suggests that lack of demand is the key issue, and that commercial buildings are rarely left empty on purpose. There was also very little evidence about how the figure of £18 million savings was arrived at, and there was a lack of reliable evidence about the number of public sector properties that would be affected, which would obviously reduce the overall amount of public expenditure savings. One interesting point, I don't know, am I pushing it? Am I right? Okay, right.
Mackay.
In the spirit that we have the time and the member seeks the information, he's correct. At Finance Committee, this information wasn't available, but by Local Government and Regeneration Committee, this information was available and is covered in the report, and I can tell him exactly what it is. The impact on the NHS, maximum £300,000, Scottish Enterprise, maximum £400,000, and councils, maximum £1.7 million, but councils particularly benefit from the £18 million saving that would be generated through the proposed change.
Well, thank the Minister for that. That was helpful. But one interesting point about the financial memorandum, as far as I can see, is that there is no assumption that owners will actually bring vacant properties back into use. Again, I may have missed that, but it seems to me that there is nothing netted from the savings based on what is the stated purpose of the legislation. So if the government doesn't believe that its policy will be effective in that regard, why should we believe it either? So it does seem to me, in conclusion... okay.
There is time.
Of course, Presiding Officer, I am trying to be helpful in the course of this debate. It's true that no targets have been set by government. Any figure between 0 and the 5,500 properties could be brought back into use. But to try and set a target, an arbitrary target on how many may be brought back into use, would be complete guesswork which doesn't actually inform the debate.
Well, thank the Minister, but I think it's quite revealing, because it does seem that a lot of the policy is based on guesswork, but it ought to be guesswork informed by such evidence as we have, and it looks as if the evidence that we have from Scotland and England has not really been properly taken into account. So in conclusion, I believe this is the wrong policy at the wrong time, and that this part of the bill should certainly be reconsidered.
Thank you very much. I now call on Nigel Dawn, after which we'll move to the closing speeches.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's an interesting experience rising this late in a debate when, one, there's not very much left to say, and two, there's probably rather more time to say it in than one would otherwise have expected. However, let me work my way through the issues that have come up. Can I say, to start off with, Presiding Officer, I'm very grateful to Kevin Stewart for his opening speech for telling me about Shetland's housing support grant. Because I must confess this was something that I didn't understand beforehand. And I have to say, as a fellow former councillor, that the idea of borrowing of your own hardboard does seem to me to be a wonderful wheeze. And I now understand, I think, just a little bit more about what might have been going on. If I could turn to the things which will be with us for very much longer, of course, let me start with the business properties. Can I make the point that every single one of these properties is an individual space? And therefore, we do actually need to look at what the effect of this bill will be on the microeconomics of that individual business space, or possibly even a subspace, because maybe some of these big units might actually be subdivided or let in parts, if that made economic sense. Now, it does seem to me, and I have never had to run a business space, I will admit, that most of the costs disappear if you do actually just shut the door and drain the cold water taps. Because the maintenance, as long as it's wind and watertight, might well be practically zero for quite a considerable period of time. And it's not especially difficult to see why landlords, particularly absentee landlords who have no interest in their local community for that building, would just simply say it was cheaper to do that than actually try and market it. So it does seem to me, let's give me just a moment, it does seem to me that it is perfectly reasonable to think that if there's actually an incentive, which happens to be business rates, to get that property back into use, then there will be a general principle that will say, well, maybe I've now got a cost that I didn't have before, maybe I should look and see whether a lower rent will actually make something work and actually get some sort of economic cycle around it.
Jim Hume.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. Would the member not agree, though, even depending on where the rent is, that the commercial property owner would always be better off if he let his property out?
No, I don't, because there is a cost in terms of there's a cost in terms of time and effort in running your business, in actually doing anything. And if you have got a portfolio of properties and you have got one over there that you don't perhaps know very much about, or one or two over there that you don't know very much about, a long way from your backyard, and actually you don't see what they're going to be used for, and there's no incentive to make that your effort, you will probably put your effort somewhere else. And you might be quite happy to live with these simply as elements of a balance sheet which will pick up eventually. So I think it is actually perfectly reasonable to say there will be occasions, and I don't know how many, when some incentive, like an additional cost called business rates, will actually wake people up and make a difference. I would also, forgive me for just for a moment, there's also, I would suggest, a general principle. I'm grateful, I can't remember who it was at the London Business School pointed out that in economics you should stick to principles and not allow yourself to be confused by the numbers. It cannot possibly be wrong that if you start putting an incentive to occupy property, incentive, a cost in front of the landlord, that rents will actually come down to try and find a market rent at which he will get some income.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Mr Dawn for giving way. I think that Mr Dawn has summed up that situation very well in the case where it is beneficial for somebody to wait. Representing the centre of Aberdeen, as I do, where there are a large amount of empty properties, but a lot of demand, but not at the rents that people can afford, there is very definitely advantage for many landlords to keep their properties empty until that rates are attainable again. And that is why myself, in searching for an office, and many others in my constituency find it very difficult to get affordable property when there is lots of empty properties about.
Indeed, I think actually in some places, and Aberdeen would be a classic, we see that. Can I also make the point, though, Presiding Officer, that this will have different effects in different places, and I think only of my own constituency, I'll only have to go to my own constituency. I think it's going to depend how far you are from a centre of business. And if I were to compare Forfar, which is not doing too badly, with Brecon, which is only 10 miles down the road, but is one more stop away from Dundee, actually there are far more empty properties, and I can see exactly the same as I come into my constituency from the north, in fact, from Aberdeen to Stonehaven, where there is no particular shortage of people who want to use business properties. There's not too much vacant. If you come the extra 15 miles down to Lawrencekirk, you see a different situation. So these things are actually place-specific, which is perhaps what you would expect with properties. Can I also make the point that in the current... Well, forgive me, just let's... Yeah, sorry, on properties, come on.
John Mason.
Yes, I think the point I was wanting to agree with him on his point about things being place-specific, because I wonder if he would agree that one of the possibilities that might happen would be people who used to have shop units below tenement buildings, which certainly happens in my constituency, might, because their minds are being focused, as he describes, consider switching that from a shop to a flat.
I would only have to look to my previous home city of Dundee to recognise that that has actually happened, and I can think of places precisely where it did. Can I also, while we're picking up on the general economics in this, and we will get to homes in just a moment, I hope, it seems to me in the current economic landscape, it's mighty difficult to calculate any effect on anything. And it seems to me that a financial statement that says that the estimates are approximate and they hope they might give a result in this direction seems to me to be, frankly, being rather more honest than some of the others that put numbers which are quoted to 2 or 3 significant figures, which I'm not sure I'm ever likely to believe in the current economic environment. Now, if I could turn on to the issue of homes and domestic dwellings. I think, first of all, I would like to welcome the idea that a penalty for non-disclosure goes up. Again, I just think wearing a former councillor's hat, the idea £200 would actually force people to do the right thing. I'm not with that. I think 500's getting towards the right answer. I wonder whether a maximum figure that's rather more than that might actually be appropriate, but I'm not quite sure how you massage that, so perhaps 500 is okay. Could I also pick up on the point which I don't think anybody else has referred to, but I noticed the Minister had. The specific issue that was brought up by the Subordinate Legislation Committee, which of course I convene, about the fact that there was no limit within the legislation as to how much domestic rates could be put up. That is in fact a point that is so fundamental that we really did think we had to point it out. Parliament does have to put a limit on any tax-raising power. But in that context, can I say to the Minister that if it's 100%, that's absolutely fine by me and it seems perfectly reasonable. If the government had felt that it could be 200%, but would probably only be at 100 for the moment, I have to say that wouldn't affect the fundamental principle. As long as there's a number in there so we know what power we're giving away as a Parliament, that is the important point. I'm very happy that it should be 100%. If that makes sense to the government, then so be it. I also very much like the point that Mark MacDonald, I think, first introduced this debate, the idea that there should, once a property has been put back into use, there should be some kind of rate relief. Okay? And I think that brings me back to the general issue of the income that's estimated and the costs. Because I must confess that I'm not sure that I would need to worry too much about those. What we want, I think, is to have houses occupied, in use. 150,000 people looking for a home, that kind of number, it doesn't matter if it's out by a factor, it's still enormous. If we can do something to eat into that number, that is good. If at the end of the day, the income and the expenditure just balance, it seems to me that's fine if we get folk back into homes. And therefore, whether the income is really 18 million or 10 million, just a moment please, John, whether it's 18 million or 10 million, frankly, it doesn't bother me, as long as it's more than the 1.8 or 3.6 or possibly 5 million that it might cost. Why worry? As long as one is significantly higher than the other, I think we're doing the right thing. John.
John Finney.
I'm grateful for the member taking the intervention. I wonder if the member would share my view that given the implications of the welfare reform and the bedroom tax, which will mean that foster children, children with a disability without an overnight carer, and indeed children who are the subject of a regular access contact won't be permitted an additional bedroom, that a considerable number of these are one-bedroom properties.
Well, I
Nigel
would
Dunn.
take the point that a lot of one-bedroom flats properties are around. I think that's fair comment, okay, but it's only a complication to the general principle. But yes, I mean, we're not necessarily going to have all the right things in the right places. I understand that. Last point, perhaps, that I ought to try and pick up on is the issue of flexibility and the idea that the rates relief on a home one side of the city might be different from the other side of the city within the same council area. Now, again, I can see why some flexibility is a really, really good thing, because there are places where you really do want to incentivise homes to come into use, and there are places where you're not so worried. I can understand that. But, of course, one person's flexibility is the next person's postcode lottery. And I just hope that those who know more about this than I do, and I've sat on none of the substantive committees on this, actually do work out where we really do need the flexibility and what that really is meant to achieve, so we don't finish up with something which actually can be criticised afterwards. Does the Minister want to comment? Yes, please do.
Minister Derek Mackay.
I thank the member for offering an intervention, and I can clarify that the discretionary power is for the empty homes element alone, presiding officer, for each local authority to decide. The scheme of empty property rates relief will still be universal and consistent across the country, and partly the reason for that is that that's both welcomed and supported by the private sector, because they want a consistent scheme across the country.
Well, indeed.
Nigel Dunn.
I'm grateful, but again, I think the Minister can see from his own local authority experience that whilst there may be a general scheme across the country, every flexibility you build in will turn out to be a double-edged sword somewhere. I think we just need to see that coming. That doesn't mean we don't do it. It just means it's a complexity perhaps we could have done without. So, in summing up, Presiding Officer, I think there's lots in here which is good. I've been slightly concerned by people talking about numbers which I think are, by definition, approximate, and we shouldn't be worrying about it. It does seem to me that the general principle is right. How effective it turns out to be is something which the history books will tell us, and I honestly don't think at this point we could predict.
Thank you very much. I salute that heroic effort. Now move to closing speeches, and I call on Alec Johnson to wind up.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by doing as one or two other speakers have done during this debate, welcoming Margaret Burgess to her new role, and I look forward to seeing how she performs in that role in future. Having worked with her on committee, I'm sure she's currently quite depressed at the fact that she will continue to benefit from my opinions or opinionated right-wing point of view in a different capacity in future. Now, before we came over to participate in this debate, I very nearly did something that I've never actually done before. I almost phoned the Minister because I needed a piece of information from him, and though I raked through my diary, I couldn't work out when it had happened. But he may remember it was a conference of commercial property interests, which took place in the Dynamic Earth across the road. Now, I can't remember when it happened. I thought it was sometime in the spring, but I couldn't find it. However, it happened just not long after the Minister had been appointed to his new role. And the discussion had, I think for most of that day's conference, surrounded the issue of commercial property, empty commercial property rates, and the proposal that they should be introduced or toughened up. And I think that the Minister enjoyed his introduction that day, where he found himself in a room with a panel who all disagreed with him, and with a large number of people in the audience who all disagreed with him. And I'm sure that experience hasn't been included in the broad consultations which he's discussed it several times today. However, I think he should take into account the fact that right from the very start, commercial property interests have been against this proposal. Now, I will continue. Now, the reason why commercial property interests are so much against this is that it is one more cost against those who are currently bearing the cost of empty properties which they cannot let up and down Scotland. Now, it's been made clear by several people during this debate that there was once a time, perhaps prior to 2007, where some unscrupulous practices may have gone on in an attempt to force up commercial rents. But 2007 is a long time ago. When properties become empty on our high streets, it's because no one wants them. And across Scotland, you will find empty properties that cannot be let. In fact, out of my own window in Stonehaven, I can see property that's been let for 6 months and then been empty for a year, let for another 6 months and then been empty for a year. And that's indicative of a market that is struggling to achieve what it wants to achieve, and that is healthy, successful high streets. We're not achieving that because the people to run these supposed businesses simply are not there. 5,500 commercial properties we believe to be empty. And as has been pointed out by many during this debate, these measures have not a hope of filling all 5,500 empty properties. How many of them would fill? The Minister can't tell us. I suggest that even if it was marginally successful, it would only be extremely marginal. Let's move on, though, and talk about the issue of housing and how this might affect it. The research that's available to us tells us that there are now over 25,000 empty homes in Scotland. But yet, if we look at these figures, the suggestion is that one of the chief offenders in keeping empty homes are councils themselves. There are also a number of other organisations, including housing associations, that find themselves in that same position. And while they have lists of tenants that they need to supply homes for, any added cost to keeping these homes while they're empty is simply a cost against those who are currently occupying property in the rented sector. Let's also look at one issue that hasn't been raised today, and that is the hybrid area between housing and commercial property. That is the private rented market. Over recent years, there has been a boom in buy-to-let, and that has even survived the onset of the recession. In the recent Housing Acts, we've heard at great length how important it is that the private rented sector plays its role in housing Scotland's homeless. And this government itself has already acted on many occasions in order to encourage that to happen. Yet, if there are currently empty properties in that sector, and I know they are, the danger is that any imposition of additional costs may simply result in those who bought to let simply selling that property again and taking it out of that marketplace. Now, I have an objection to the fact that the government have looked at a situation where there's an option to take either the carrot or the stick approach, and they've chosen the stick. I think they should have chosen the carrot. I would suggest that the powers already available to local authorities when levying rates on empty properties are probably adequate, and that the government should have decided to go for the positives in encouraging people to do all they can to make property available and to make it attractive. Even this very day, Eric Pickles in the House of Commons has been talking about relaxing planning bureaucracy and restrictions that currently prevent many properties who are marginally habitable becoming improved. Here in Scotland, particularly perhaps in our wealthier areas, there are large numbers of empty properties which individuals find it very difficult to get planning permission to develop. It's important that we have a system that is fit for purpose, and we need to address that. Finally, there has been a number of times during this debate repetition of the line that this is only an enabling power, that it may not be used and so on. I would suggest that this government, if it considers it unlikely to be used, should think of doing something different. Why should we introduce more charges at a time when markets are weak? We should be supporting those who find themselves in difficulties to get property back into the marketplace. Finally, there's one comment I'd like to make, and it relates to something that Joan McAlpin said. And it's very different from the rest of what I've had to say. And that is, we need to remember that these enemies of ours, who apparently hold property in our cities, commercial property, and are not putting it up for let, are somehow faceless. They're somehow not important. Many of them are small businessmen, but the faceless owners that Joan McAlpin described are the people who run our pension funds. And for the good of the country in the long term, we need to ensure that investment in property remains attractive. I believe this measure will actually make it less attractive in the long run.
Thank you very much. I now call on Elaine Murray to close for Labour.
Thank you. How long have I got, Presiding Officer?
Quite a generous 8 minutes. You can have a good deal longer than that, if you wish. Provided you've got something good to say.
Oh, I always have something good to say, Presiding Officer.
Never been an issue before.
Well, can I start by welcoming Margaret Burgess to her new role, and I will look forward to shadowing part of your responsibilities as I do Mr Brown, so I look forward to working with you. Can I say in starting that I had considerable, and still do have considerable, sympathy for the policy intention of this bill. Many of the towns and villages in my own constituency are plagued with properties which have lain empty for periods of years, former shops up from my office in the Friars Venel, in Dumfries, the former co-op store in Kirkconnell, descending into disrepute, basically. The former Chinese restaurant and associated flats outside Lockerbie Station. These are just a few examples. And I've also seen how sympathetic restoration can help transform a townscape. If you look at the investment by David Smith in transforming the Grade A-listed townhouse building, Bridge House, in Annan back to its former glory, and in doing so, vastly improving the entrance to Annan's main street. So I came to this bill feeling very well disposed towards it. Indeed, I was well disposed, of course, because it mirrored the legislation introduced by the Labour Party in the UK Parliament in 2008. And it was because of the evidence we heard at the Finance Committee on the proposals, particularly for commercial properties, which gave me cause for concern. And I began to worry that this is not the right policy at the right time. And I began to feel that probably that may not achieve the aims, and its aims I agree with, but I'm not convinced it will achieve it. And
Minister Derek Mackay.
I think that's a very helpful explanation, and I've been able to outline some of the amendments that the Government is considering. In that spirit, is the Opposition able to offer amendments here and now as to how you think the bill could be improved?
One of the ways in which the bill could be improved is actually requiring a BREA to be undertaken, as a number of members have said. And we do need to see, I mean, you have told us that you have a number of amendments. We need to see that detail, as Sarah Boyack and others have said. I'm hearing for the first time that information has been made available to the Local Government Committee, which was not available to the Finance Committee. Now, have you updated the financial memorandum? Because at the moment, we at stage one are discussing the original bill and the original financial memorandum. And as Margaret Mitchell said, those are a rather sloppy piece of work. That sloppiness needs to be tidied up. You said in response to my colleague John Pentland that you will issue a response on this early next week. I'm afraid that's not early enough. That is actually sloppiness which is bordering on being disrespectful to Parliament, because that should have been here before we started debating this. We should have seen what you intended to do at that point, and that would have enabled us to make a more informed debate around what your proposals are actually going to be. Now, if I can turn to the evidence which was presented to the Finance Committee. We took evidence from David Mulhoolish of the Scottish Property Federation and Tom Stokes of the Business Centre Association. Can I say, in response to what Mark MacDonald was saying about the improvements, because there's no industrial or listed buildings in these proposals, these are people who are talking about business centre developments to encourage the development of small businesses. So I think actually their criticisms remain relevant, despite the fact that there are improvements over what happened in England. Tom Stokes. Surely, yeah.
Thank you very much for taking that intervention. Yes, I think I just want to reiterate the fact that because small independent businesses have not been consulted, the report is rather shy in terms of full facts. And as Sarah Boyd quite clearly said, that there are so many details missing, you can't really make a decision. And I think I can't emphasize enough, small businesses up and down our cities are being blocked and bogged down, and no one's actually talking to them. We're talking to institutions, we're talking to unions, we're talking to federations, but not the actually people who are actually on the coalface delivering that service. Therefore, I will suggest that perhaps the Minister could address that point as well, please.
I mean, I'm particularly concerned about the effect, the evidence we got from the Business Centre Association. John Mason said the evidence is weak. Well, I don't think the evidence was weak, because what Tom Stokes told us was that when the legislation was introduced in England, Labour legislation was introduced in England, he said, and I quote, "the creation of new premises almost came to a standstill." The UK government, was then subsequently persuaded to introduce a threshold of £15,000 and subsequently £18,000, and then the market picked up. And the coalition government reduced the threshold down to £2,600, and again they've witnessed a virtual standstill in new centres outside of London, with the economy in London being rather different. One of the effects of the recession, of course, has been the cessation of building new business centres, because at the moment the cost of building is greater than the end value, and therefore older properties which are no longer economic in their current use or unlettable are more likely to be attractive propositions and the area where growth is likely to grow. However, it was pointed out to us that development of these types of properties will not result in immediate 100% occupation. And this relates to the points that Nigel Donn made in what I felt was an extremely reasonable and well-reasoned speech. A business centre may have 50% occupation, typically 50% occupation in its first year, maybe 75% in its second year, and about 90% thereafter as businesses grow and as turnover happens. And additional taxation on the unoccupied units makes that sort of investment less attractive, and that is the sort of investment we're going to need to encourage the small business sector. Mention was made by a number of members about the lack of a BRIA, and as I've said, that's actually one thing we would like to see at stage 2, a requirement before introducing. You say it's an enabling bill, quite rightly, many bills which go through this Parliament are enabling bills, but we would like to see a requirement that a BRIA is undertaken before any secondary legislation comes forward. After all, secondary legislation does not carry with it the same level of consultation or the same level of parliamentary scrutiny, and I think we do need to have that. And as was said in the debate, the scale of the BRIA can be proportionate to the task. It doesn't need to mean that because it's a small amount of money in comparison to the total take, doesn't mean to say that a BRIA is not important for those individual businesses and those individual business sectors, like small businesses which might want to be using the sorts of development the Business Centre Association is talking about. And Sarah and others also made and Jim, I think Jim Hume also made reference to the sort of claims that should be around bomb site Britain. Now, I know some of that is anecdotal. It came out of the property press in England, but there seems to have been an implication within the press that are you saying my time's up? I don't know. I thought you were making signals that actually that in some cases the owners were demolishing properties which were hard to let in order to avoid empty property rates. As Anne McTaggart also said, long-term unoccupied properties are not only in the ownership of the private sector and the public sector, and I know this has been included in information which has gone to the local government committee subsequently. The public sector does have a fair amount of unoccupied property, and indeed we were told that the Freedom of Information request on a survey of local authorities in England and Wales, which was performed by the Business Centre Association, suggests that the English legislation cost the public sector around £400 million annually. So we do need to look at that. We need to learn the lessons of that. Local authorities also expressed other concerns to us about the proposals. North Lanarkshire believe that the focus of the tax is tax raising, and I think John Pentland mentioned that, rather than determining the need for funding to bring empty properties into use. And I realise that's a difficult task at the current time, but it is a tax raising measure first and foremost. And Bain of Angus Council advised that the issue they had to look at was that they had a significant number of properties which are not up to marketable standard, and the individuals concerned do not have the funding to bring them up to standard. She also pointed out to us that there are around 1,000 unoccupied properties in Angus, and I'm sure Dumfries and Galloway would have a similar problem to this. They're spread around a rural area. So there's actually a resource issue for local authorities in being able to inspect, to carry out their inspection duty in terms of those buildings. Jim Hume mentioned the housing support grant, which of course only affects Shetland Council. I had some sympathy for Shetland Council. I know they had huge reserves, and they have this history of housing debt, which was due to the need to develop housing connected with the development of the oil fields at Sullom Voe. And at that time, the island's population rose by about 40%, causing the council to have to borrow around £50 million. Now, I know that the local authority has made money out of that, but equally it was not Shetland Island Council's fault that Margaret Thatcher brought in the right to buy, and a lot of those houses were then sold off for less than they actually cost to build. So I think they've got a point. I'm quite interested. I didn't know prior to Kevin Stewart's speech that actually they had been borrowing from a harbour support trust. That sounds quite a canny move rather than from the Public Works borrowing.
Kevin Stewart.
An extremely canny move on the part of Shetland, and as I say, I congratulate them for their canniness in that regard. One of the things is that previous Westminster governments supposedly said that they would eventually pay off that debt. Unfortunately, it seems that at that time, Shetland got no written guarantee in that regard. It seems to be yet another scenario where Westminster has not lived up to its obligations. It actually just be Shetland being canny in that regard as well, actually, by making that particular allegation. But I think actually the issue of transitional relief, the situation cannot continue for good, definitely not. But I think possibly the issue of transitional relief should be looked at. Maybe not to the sort of sums of money which they are demanding, of course, but that maybe ought to be looked at. The evidence presented to the Lead Committee was generally supportive of the proposals for a discretionary power to councils. Anne Bain of Angus Council did actually talk about some problems around that. She thought that there could be an incentivisation of owners to evade payment. And she also made a good point, actually, that sometimes the owners of unoccupied properties live out with Scotland. They may live in England where the court system is different. To be anecdotal, I have an issue in my own local authority where there's been a home lying empty for years in Kirkconnell Main Street. We sort of know who owns it, but we can't get them. We keep trying to write to these people that they exist somewhere, but they live in Wales or somewhere like that. We just haven't been able to try. I've tried, my predecessor tried, and we've just not been able to track this person down to upkeep the whole. So there are difficulties, actually, particularly when somebody's outside the country and it's a different court system, actually, and being able to pursue some of those people. Finally, I think some witnesses felt that the interplay between other forms of tax relief had not been properly considered, and I understand from what the Minister has said that some of that has actually been addressed now. Again, I would ask the Minister, do you intend to bring forward an updated financial memorandum which actually recognises some of these issues? If these sums have been done now, can we actually see those in a financial memorandum which is presented to Parliament and actually lets us see how some of those particular concerns are addressed? And in closing, I would say we have concerns about parts of this bill. We are prepared to support the bill going forward towards the amendment stage and looking at what happens at amendment stage. But that doesn't mean that it is with a degree of disappointment, actually, that I have to say that I'm not as enthusiastic about this bill at the end of stage one as I was when I first started looking at it. But I think there is an opportunity for us to look at improving the bill, and I look forward to people working together to do that. But at the moment, we will support the bill, but with significant reservations.
Thank you very much. I now call on Derek Mackay to close for the Government.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I say I think this has been a very encouraging debate. I think a number of the issues that have been raised in this bill have been put across very constructively, and I particularly welcome the position of the Labour Party in expressing your concerns, not necessarily amendments at this stage, but seeking information with which, if you are provided, you may further move on your position. So I would say at the outset, to rise to the challenge as given by Elaine Murray, will I reassess, reorder the financial information to give a fuller perspective on the bill as it's evolved, including today? Yes, I will, and if that will help inform that debate to reach a satisfactory conclusion, then I think that would be certainly worth doing. Alec Johnston was right that I had a fairly new appointment and quite a hard time at the Scottish Property Federation. You're absolutely right. I'm not used to being in a hall where everybody is against me, including the panel and all members present, unlike the Conservatives, and Alec Johnston may have experienced that in his own party. I am unaccustomed to such a political environment. I have once attended the Tory party conference in my time in local government. I was informed I was giving a better reception than the then Tory spokesperson. Maybe that's why I didn't feature in the promotion to the Cabinet this week. But on the subject of the reshuffle, it was expressed that Sarah Boyack maybe didn't prepare in the way that she thought she was going to, because the reshuffle may have affected me. I missed the reshuffle because I was at the conference of the Institute of Revenues Rating and Valuation as the reshuffle was happening. Such is my dedication to this issue of rates, and I'm more than happy to be leading for this period both parts of the bill. Malcolm Chisholm described it as a bill of two halves. Well, of course, there's the Shetland issue through the Housing Support Grant as well, and that is an important issue. I think both sides of the bill will make a difference in bringing empty properties back into use. But John Pentland made a very helpful contribution in how he dealt with the interventions in this debate, and only accepting interventions if he thought the intervention wouldn't forward or progress someone's career within the government and within the Scottish National Party. I have never seen the backbenches of the SNP so animated at that point. I've never seen so many spontaneous interventions. Every member, of course, of the Scottish National Party fit for government, which is maybe not the position enjoyed down south in terms of Westminster government. I welcome the Kevin Stewart's comments and welcoming the statements around how the bill can be improved, and Nigel Dawn, of course, in terms of the Subordinate Legislation Committee. Now, to turn to the specific points. On empty homes, it is right that we give discretionary powers to local authorities to take steps that are right for their areas in tackling the scourge of empty homes, a scandal whilst we have so many people waiting to be housed. It is right that the regulations are being consulted upon so that we can ensure that the regulations are right, and we have moved to take on board the concerns from the committee and indeed the contributions made in Parliament today.
Mark MacDonald.
I thank the Minister for taking the intervention. Alec Johnson was talking about the buy-to-let market. Would the Minister agree that, looking at this on a discretionary council-by-council basis, there are some areas where the buy-to-let market rents are still far too high to encourage people to take up those rents, and that such measures might perhaps encourage them to look at a more affordable rent rather than the aspirational rents which are often being used?
Derek Mackay.
Well, that's right, and contrary to the case that was being expressed by Alec Johnson, actually only 2,000 of the 25,000 long-term empty properties liable for council tax are actually socially rented houses. But if we can return to empty homes, there's the package of incentives, there is the funding support to bring empty homes back into use, and this proposed new power at the discretion of local government to make that difference. And I welcome the comments from Shelter Scotland, who said, "We believe that charging a council tax increase on long-term empty homes is useful and appropriate where it's part of a package of measures being implemented by a council to bring long-term empty homes back into use." That seems a welcome statement and in the spirit of the bill as proposed. In terms of the housing support grant for Shetland Island Council, it is the case that there has been a subsidy over a period of time, some £80 million in support since 1979. Under anyone's reckoning, that is a generous package, but of course with the range of issues that that council is wrestling with at this moment, we would want to ensure that we consider their finances in the round and work with them in partnership to support the transitional arrangements as described by others. And there are alternatives to simply rent rises to ensure that this mitigates the impact on tenants in that island authority area. But much of the debate was on the empty property rates relief, maybe not surprising from other discussions. I reiterate again that this is an enabling power. Why is the enabling power so important? Because always the Scottish Government has tried to ensure that the rates system and the rates support and the rates relief in Scotland has a competitive advantage over the rest of the United Kingdom. And this enabling of power continues to give us that ability, that flexibility to be able to change through a statutory instrument the rate support to ensure that if any other part of the United Kingdom changes or varies their support, we can do so just as quickly and just as effectively, in the exact same way that we can with the small business bonus or indeed the poundage. And interestingly, the system of ministerial responsibility to bring regulations to Parliament for scrutiny under statutory instrument as opposed to primary legislation was good enough for other administrations in respect to poundage and small business bonus, so why not empty property rates relief as well? I've had a number of discussions, not just with representative bodies, as important as they are, but with individual property owners as well, small and big. And of course their representatives through the Association of Town Centre Managers, others, Scottish Property Federation, the Chamber of Commerce, SCDI, and councils as well as the conference I referred to earlier. So I've had a wide range of consultation to ensure that we can refine our policy to achieve both the saving that we have to make and refine it to actually deliver the incentivisation to bring our properties across Scotland back into use.
I thank the Minister for giving way. One of the areas that we wanted to question in the committee, and unfortunately were unable to do so, was to talk to those folks who are involved in business improvement districts. I wonder if the Minister would talk to those folk, like I have done in my own area in Aberdeen, because I think that they have got a lot to give. And like Mr Malek's comments earlier, often these areas contain a large amount of small businesses, and that would give them their say in these proposals.
Minister? Of course that would be very helpful to this discussion, because as part of the rates review, we'll consult on how the rates system works and whether the reliefs are proportionate and contributing to sustainable economic growth. We will also have a package of support for our town centres as well as part of the town centre review that was a manifesto commitment and will take forward imminently. The other measure in terms of how the policy can be refined could be around the scheme in Northern Ireland where relief is given once a property is filled. And that's the kind of constructive suggestion from Mark MacDonald MSP which will help ensure that this policy more effectively meets the ambition that other members of the Parliament say they share. Of course.
Can I thank the Minister for taking my intervention? It was merely to ask, do you have a current timescale, Minister, for when you intend to bring forward statutory instruments on the two parts of the bill about which there's been most discussion this afternoon?
On conclusion and passing of the primary legislation, we would then look at returning to Parliament for the statutory instruments. That could be round about Christmas, maybe before, maybe just after, but as quickly as we can bring it to Parliament, and that's why the consultation and engagement is ongoing. And you know, that engagement is so important, to talk to individuals, to talk to property owners, to talk to representatives, to talk to professionals working within the sector to ensure that we get it right. And I've been asked again and again by the opposition, why no BRIA? And I've explained the difference and the consistent approach in keeping with the advice around BRIA. But you know, that ongoing consultation, that refinement of policy, I would argue, is better than BRIA, because we're not just consulting on what was proposed at the budget, we're refining our policy as we go to make sure that at the time in which it is implemented, it creates greatest effect. I referred earlier to the overall rates review that we will be conducting, because the package of rates are the most generous than any other part of the United Kingdom. Over £500 million towards rates in this country to support a range of organisations and sectors to survive. And some parties in here, of course, voted against that generous package, the most generous in the United Kingdom. Now, we are confident of our figures, and we've been asked how our figures don't match up or don't marry up to that provided by the Scottish Property Federation. The answer is clear. We use the data that's provided by local government and our own statisticians. What the Scottish Property Federation have done is modelled it on the basis of a sample, and that is why those figures don't match up. But we are confident of what we project in terms of the savings that could be achieved and those who would be eligible for support. In terms of incentivising owners, as a package of support, it is worth putting this saving into perspective. Of course, a saving we are having to make because of the cuts of the UK government in Westminster, but putting into proportion the £18 million, that's the saving that's made from the proposed changes on empty property rates relief to an income in rates of £2.5 billion. And even with the proposed reforms, which may change as a consequence of the debate, the cost after reform over the revaluation period will still be £721 million over 5 years. That's actually more expensive than the very popular and effective small business bonus scheme, which costs a projected £697 million over the same period. If circumstances change, we will, if this bill is passed, have the flexibility to adapt to ensure that we are at the cutting edge of delivering the right financial packages for Scotland's commercial sector. We've learned lessons from what happened in England and elsewhere. That's why we're continuing relief for industrial and listed properties. Some of the anecdotal experiences that have been explained has informed that opinion, and I think it's right that we do that. I think it's right that we provide practical help, say, around organisations and companies who may want to promote further their empty properties. So Scottish Enterprise and other agencies are working with us on this. But when it comes to evidence for the policy, we cannot take what happened in England in isolation, because at the same time as the policy was coming in, then we had the euro crisis, the recession, and of course, soon after, the UK increase in VAT, a cost to Scotland alone of over £1 billion to the commercial sector in Scotland, over £1 billion. So the evidence there was that there was no control situation to be able to understand exactly what the impact would be, what the evidence said, either way, for or against the policy. A policy, of course, designed by Gordon Brown, and I'm not given to quoting Gordon Brown, but I'll reiterate the quote that was given earlier. Commercial property lying empty should not continue to be given generous business rate relief, particularly because this leads to higher rents in areas with highest demand. As I say, that was the Labour Party's position that the Tories now want to disown. Well, in the newspapers, but in government, actually, the UK government is continuing with that policy. And all the rhetoric about George Osborne's reviewing the policy, nobody seems to have told his Minister for Local Government, who produced a paper saying there was no evidence that the policy had a negative effect, but to change it would, I quote, be unaffordable. So it seems it's good enough for the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in England, but for some reason not in Scotland. It's do as we say from the Conservatives, not as we do. I think many members have very helpfully explained the rationale and how reducing empty property rates relief will stimulate people into action to ensure that properties are occupied. I think Joan McAlpin's contribution was very helpful in that. Jim Hume referred to carrot and the stick. There is both incentivisation here and the changes proposed. I've outlined the impact of the public sector to the pence of the maximum that it would cost. But of course that pales into insignificance of the £18 million saved that will contribute to local services as a consequence of this policy. Of course, it must come with a package of actions to support our town centres, and that is why I welcome the town centre review that will take place imminently. That is why we're working hard on the planning reforms to ensure that we create the right conditions for Scotland and the right controls to enable sustainable economic growth. It has been commented that the bill or the one element of it, didn't have much support. Of course, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors has said RICS Scotland wishes to see all land and property to have a purpose and be used efficiently. Empty property does not make valid contributions to the Scottish economy, environment or generally the sociability of places. Therefore, RICS Scotland agrees with the Scottish Government that the issue of unused and vacant properties needs to be addressed and would welcome positive measures that revitalise Scotland's high streets and town centres. So there is increasing support across Scotland for the measures we are proposing to realise the opportunities in our communities, to tackle the issue of unused and underused properties. It will be further expanded upon in the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill as well. But I can tell you that this package will meet both aims of achieving the saving as outlined in the budget, but as refined, deliver the stimulation to support activity to fill hitherto empty properties, potentially up to 5,500 empty commercial properties filled, empty homes filled to house people desperately looking for accommodation and in need. So these are measures.
You can wind up now, Minister.
These are measures designed to make the greatest change to support Scotland, and I think they will have the right effect. So I ask Parliament to support the bill, to give us the enabling power to make it happen.
The next item of business is consideration of motion number 3534 in the name of John Swinney on the Local Government Finance, Unoccupied Properties, etc. Scotland Bill Financial Resolution. I call on Derek Mackay to move the motion. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 4011 in the name of Alex Salmond on the appointment of junior Scottish ministers. Members should note that the question on this motion will be put immediately after the debate and not at decision time. I call on Alex Salmond to speak to and move the motion. Mr Salmond, you have up to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to seek parliamentary approval of the appointment of Margaret Burgess, Joe Fitzpatrick, Paul Wheelhouse and Humza Yousaf as ministers. In doing so, I obviously also want to record my gratitude for the huge contribution to this government by Bruce Crawford, Brian Adam and Stuart Stevenson, who are stepping down. I think it's fair to say that Bruce Crawford is held in enormous respect across all the parties in this Parliament. I think it's fair to say that because among Bruce's duties, and he's still in office as we speak, is writing speeches such as this for the First Minister. So I think we can be confident of that point. But piloting a challenging legislative programme in any Parliament at any time is a difficult job. But to do that in 4 years of minority government was a totally extraordinary job. In that period, and this is perhaps an admission I'm unwise to make, I wasn't entirely convinced, given the arithmetic of the Parliament, when the government came to office in 2007, that it would manage to survive the full term. I hope that I never betrayed any lack of confidence in the longevity of the government when I was leading it. But nonetheless, the odd occasion, the odd narrow squeak, the odd budget vote, the odd close vote, the odd tied vote often came with a likely possibility that the term of office might end with a dunt. The fact that it didn't end with a dunt, the fact that we managed to get through our legislative programme, the fact that a minority government proceeded in 4 years in office is, I think, more due to Bruce Crawford than any other single individual. Now, working with Bruce, Brian Adams' talents as a Chief Whip were undoubtedly essential to maintaining that government in office and to ensuring we're able to progress the legislative programme. Brian has always been a trailblazer for the SNP in the cause of independence. He was elected to public office in a 1988 by-election to Aberdeen City Council and became the only SNP member on the council at that time. Brian has often observed to me that his talents as Chief Whip though they had to be displayed a number of times in an SNP group, had their sternness test when he had to whip himself in Aberdeen City Council. But his talents as the Chief Whip over that period were exemplary, and we owe Brian Adam an enormous debt of gratitude for his work. Stuart Stevenson, as Minister for Environment and Climate Change, has been an intelligent, eloquent, indeed passionate champion of Scotland's world-leading climate change legislation passed unanimously by this Parliament. And Stuart has championed that cause not just in Scotland but in countries around the world, conscious that our efforts in climate change can only make a difference if we encourage others to share that ambition. That legacy will be remembered as we move forward, and I know that he'll continue to champion these issues in Parliament and indeed outside Parliament. I think to have as one of the legacies of your ministerial contribution that legislation is an accolade almost beyond compare in terms of the lifetime of this Parliament. So well done to Stuart Stevenson. Now, all three members will continue to make contributions in this Parliament, will continue to serve their constituencies with distinction, and we wish them all well for the future in their parliamentary endeavours. Now, the four new ministers that I wish to appoint are well aware they've got some hard acts to follow. Prior to Margaret Burgess' election in 2011, she had a career working for the East Ayrshire Citizens Advice Bureau, and if approved, she'll take up the new position of Minister for Housing and Welfare, where that experience will prove invaluable. That appointment reflects the importance of housing in aiding economic recovery, but also the challenge facing those in poverty, indeed the challenge facing Scotland in terms of the welfare changes. And these challenges have been highlighted by both Citizens Advice Scotland and Save the Children this week. Joe Fitzpatrick was a member of Dundee City Council for 8 years before becoming the MSP for Dundee West. He more than trebled his majority last year, which I think illustrates the high regard he's held in by the people of that city. Joe and his commitment to the city currently takes him to Japan, where he's seeking to potentially twin city status to further Dundee's links to that country, and it's meeting the V&A architect Kengo Kuma and his team to discuss the exciting new development in Dundee's waterfront. I think I can confidently say that Joe is the first person in the history of this Parliament to be in Japan when he was appointed a government minister. Paul Wheelhouse was a professional economist before joining Parliament. If approved, he'll be Minister for the Environment and Climate Change, taking forward Scotland's work on these hugely internationally important areas of policy. And Humza Yousaf, one of the youngest MSPs in the Parliament, having graduated only 5 years ago, since then he has served as Parliamentary Assistant to Bashir Ahmed, the first Muslim member of this Parliament, and Humza Yousaf becomes the first Muslim minister in this Parliament, demonstrating, I think, that this is a Parliament for all of Scotland, a hugely important commitment and demonstration to make. And finally, I've made changes to the responsibilities of two of my Cabinet Secretaries. Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's longest-serving Health Secretary, is moving to become Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure Investment in Cities, spearheading the work on capital investment, which is crucial to our economic recovery. She'll have the lead responsibility as well for preparations on the referendum, and she's already indeed been active in that role, meeting with Scotland Office Minister David Mundell this morning. Alec Neil has done a fine job as Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure and Capital Investment, overseeing the establishment of our £60 billion infrastructure investment plan and saving the Scottish public sector £130 million in a single year through the work of the Scottish Futures Trust. He will take on Nicola's responsibilities as current Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing. Both Nicola Sturgeon and Alec Neil performed admirably in my estimation in their previous portfolios, and Scotland is better off for their contribution. Taking together, these changes to the Scottish Government strengthen our focus on economic recovery and also in seeking the powers that will enable Scotland to drive that recovery. They give responsibilities to four able new ministers, and they further strengthen a team which is dedicated to working for Scotland with competence, energy and ambition towards a welfare and fairer country. I move, therefore, Presiding Officer, that Parliament agrees that Margaret Burgess, Joe Fitzpatrick, Paul Wheelhouse and Humza Yousaf be appointed as junior Scottish ministers.
Before I call on Ken Macintosh, can members who wish to take part in the debate press the request to speak button now? Ken Macintosh, you have up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And before tongues start to wag or speculation mounts, I can assure you there has been no reshuffle or palace coup on the Labour benches, and Joanne Lamont sends her apologies for not being able to attend this afternoon's debate. It does give me great pleasure, however, to extend a warm, progressive Labour welcome full of forward-thinking positivity to the newly appointed team of Scottish Government ministers. We look forward to working with each and every one and to engaging with the Government and sharing Labour's inspirational and aspirational vision for the future of Scotland. Before I turn to the appointments, however, I would like first of all also to pay tribute to the three ministers who are demitting office, Stuart Stevenson, Brian Adam and Bruce Crawford. They have achieved the remarkable feat from the opposition perspective, certainly, of representing the Scottish Government and the SNP whilst retaining their likeability. In their dealings with the Parliament and with the Scottish people, I believe that each have deservedly earned a reputation for fairness, sensitivity and good humour. And I would like to thank them all for the service they have given the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament over several years. Brian Adam is one of the founding members of this Parliament and has now served in many different capacities as a list MSP, as a constituency MSP, as a committee convener and as a minister. And I know he will continue to make a substantial and usually Doric contribution from the backbenches. Stuart Stevenson, sometime pilot, bank manager, psychiatric nurse, chauffeur to the First Minister, inventor of the computer. Now, unfortunately, has another former post to add to the most impressive resume in Hollywood. I believe we were all delighted that Stuart was able to survive the weather, but this season, unfortunately, he has not seen out the change in the political weather. Bruce Crawford has won much admiration, particularly for his handling of the business manager's role through 4 years of minority administration. And I believe Mr Crawford gained not just the respect of opposition politicians, but the friendship too, a rarity indeed in our cynical world. And he'll be genuinely missed by politicians from the front bench, from our party and from his own. And much as it is sad to see Bruce Crawford step down from office, he will be the first to admit that the one downside of being business manager is that it stops you from speaking in Parliament. The flip side of that argument, of course, is that it gives us in the opposition parties a very good reason to welcome Joe Fitzpatrick to the new post. Without wishing to be too cruel to Mr Fitzpatrick, if the public face of the business manager's job is to bob up and down in Parliament, reading a pre-prepared and predictable script without being unduly troubled by independent thought, then he is not only the perfect candidate, he has trained assiduously for the past 5 years. I'm equally not sure whether Mr Fitzpatrick's appointment will give hope or disappointment to his colleagues in the sycophantic tendency on the SNP backbenches. Clearly, for Bob Doris, Jamie Hepburn, Annabel Ewing, or the new boy trying on Joe's crown as the most exuberant and loyal interventionist, the ever-enthusiastic Kevin Stewart. There may be short-term disappointment that this time round their phone did not ring, but they can see that phoning obedience is a long-term avenue to successful promotion. As for the other appointments, I am pleased that Margaret Burgess will be able to bring her experience from the Citizens Advice Bureau and elsewhere to bear on the tricky and troubled area of welfare reform. This will be a difficult task, and we all wish her well in this area of work. And I give my congratulations too to Hamza Youssef, the acceptable face of the SNP, the poster boy of Scottish nationalism. He has been given an equally difficult task, that of ensuring Fiona Hislop remains in the Cabinet. But I have no doubt whatsoever that Hamza is there entirely on his own merits, but I also want to congratulate him on his appointment as the Scottish Government's first Muslim minister. And of course, I am similarly delighted for Paul Wheelhouse on his elevation. a backbencher who has earned a reputation for intelligent, informed contributions in the Chamber. I was pleased to hear that when summoned to Bute House, Mr Wheelhouse's first reaction was to assume he was in trouble with the boss, an attitude that I imagine will go down well with the First Minister. But if I may, Presiding Officer, I will conclude with the headline appointment and a slightly more serious point. I was a little baffled by the appointment of Alex Neil, and I'm assuming it is a promotion to Health Secretary. What exactly, I asked myself, were his lists of achievements at infrastructure? Surely it can't have been to send jobs to China. Or perhaps it was to announce dozens of long-term projects that may or may not happen over 20 years, and then to withdraw funding from projects that should be happening now. The only conclusion I could come to is that the First Minister took a leaf out of David Cameron's book, and if Jeremy Hunt can be promoted to health for his handling of the Murdoch affair, then Mr Neil deserves similar treatment. And yes, last but certainly not least, Alex Neil's predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, the Minister, Mr Salmon, described today with no apparent trace of irony as a modern-day Nye Bevan. So successful, in fact, that she is to be given 6 jobs. As well as being Mr Salmon's loyal deputy, she is now responsibility for infrastructure, for capital spending, for welfare reform and housing, for cities, and, of course, her #1 priority for delivering the referendum. Plenty of jobs for Ms Sturgeon, when what this government should be delivering is plenty of work for the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, the accusation has been laid at the feet of the SNP that they have identified the wrong political priorities, that they have promoted independence when they should be promoting the pressing needs of the people of Scotland, the economy. But I do look forward with positivity and with optimism, and the challenge surely is to prove us wrong. It is a great honour and a privilege to be appointed as a Scottish Government Minister, and on behalf of my Labour colleagues, I wish all of those so named today well in their work on behalf of the people of Scotland.
I now call Jackson Carlow. Mr Carlow, you have about 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I join Ken McIntosh firstly in paying tribute to Bruce Crawford? I have to say that I think that the task he performed in the last Parliament was remarkable, and I think it's a hallmark of his character and the way in which he forged relationships across this chamber that he was not only an ambassador for this Parliament, but he would have been a model in his responsibilities in any Parliament. And I think that's a very considerable thing to say. I'd like to obviously associate those comments with Brian Adam as well, and I know he has continued in office despite difficulty, and I wish him every success, and Bruce Crawford, as they take up their position on the backbenches. I genuinely regret the passing of Stuart Stevenson from government. I do so not for the most obvious reason, but simply because members, I imagine, must now reconcile themselves to having to endure the forthcoming substantial autobiography modestly entitled How I Saved the Planet, but a required Christmas present, I would imagine. I spoke about Nicola Sturgeon yesterday, and can I say I am very much looking forward to my time across the chamber with Mr Neil, bringing his strangulated hyperbole to the subject of health. I know that in the canteen, the days when we see his plate piled high with the best nursery food that the canteen can provide will have to go behind him. I certainly look forward to playing Bond to his Blofeld. I don't know where that leaves Jackie Bailey, but it says much about this Parliament that the cross-party poster team for healthy living should be Alec Neil, Jackie Bailey, Alison McInnes and myself. To the new ministers, I'm very pleased, and I know Humza Yousaf will be hugely indebted to me, that when Derek Mackay was appointed, I said it wouldn't be long before Humza Yousaf followed suit. He was dazzling us then. He is an absolute poster boy for the very best of private education, a good Hutcheson's Grammar School boy. I was a governor at the school when Humza was a pupil. He had a very considerable reputation for what, it would be indelicate for me to say. But I certainly wish him well. I, too, pay tribute to the fact he is the first Muslim minister in this Parliament. I think he's going to be a very considerable addition to the government. Back in the days when Sir Graham Macmillan led the Conservative Party and met with Helen Liddle as the General Secretary of Labour, there was, I like to think, a long-term infiltration programme put in place with regard to the SNP. It's succeeded today in that the former Young Conservative leader in Aberdeen, Paul Wheelhouse, has been made a minister in this administration. Paul's mother Paul's mother, Ruth, who was an employed Conservative agent returning Conservative MPs in Edinburgh, kindly donated her son to this project. And those of us on this side of the chamber are delighted to see the first fruits of this long-term plan bearing fruit. It gives great hope to us all. I do welcome Paul Wheelhouse to government, and I know he will do well. Margaret Burgess, I think modestly, was not expecting, her appointment, was quietly traipsing round the bar on the night before, but I'm sure... but I'm quite sure she will be an excellent addition to the team too. The most wily of the appointments, though, is surely Joe Fitzpatrick. He has been picked because the First Minister, I think, recognised the challenge I said that he was creating for himself by this great chorus of the great disappointed on his back benches. And I say to Marco Biagio, he will learn from his indulgence in a reckless, red-blooded summer of hot-flushed flirtation with the NATO 9 this summer, and hopefully his time will come again. But Joe Fitzpatrick, I know the conversation the First Minister will have had with him. Joe, I'm turning to you. I want you to show those rebels in the backbenches, lead them from the fields of rebellion back to the righteous plains of prostate genuflection in support of the government. It may not prove as easy. A taste for rebellion, sometimes gained, is difficult to lose. Presiding Officer, the politics of all of this I leave to yesterday and to tomorrow. For today, my colleagues pay tribute to the service to the government and the country of those ministers departing, and on a personal basis, and within the bounds of political reason and propriety, we support the motion in the First Minister's name and wish all of his new colleagues every possible success.
Will there any?
I do pay tribute to Bruce Crawford, I think, who serves in the same region as me, and he's always been courteous and very diligent colleague, I think. He skillfully steered through his party through the minefields of minority government. So I pay tribute to Bruce, a heartfelt tribute for the work. I know the commitment is considerable, and we should all be grateful for that. And to Brian Adam, who in a former life was a great assistance to me when I was working in science, somebody who's always been dedicated, puts party politics aside to deal with the greater cause. So I pay tribute to Brian as well. And to Stuart Stevenson. I assume he can now devote his full attention to his inspiring and sometimes flamboyant approval, at least I think it's approval, of my questioning of the First Minister every week. He's never quiet when it comes to that. I'm never quite sure he approves of what I say. We discussed earlier on in question time the change of balance in the government, and we've registered our concern that the most senior minister has been diverted to lead the referendum campaign. But it's not just me that's concerned. Earlier, the First Minister today hinted that he wanted ministers to serve 5-year terms like Nye Bevan. So in half a sentence, he wiped out the promotion prospects for a generation of SNP backbenchers. They're looking worried now. So I particularly welcome today those who could be the last new SNP ministers we ever see. Humza Yousaf, Margaret Burgess, Paul Wheelhouse and Joe Fitzpatrick. But I want to pay tribute to them and to those who are retiring, because politics, we all know, is not an easy life. We're not universally loved by our voters, and working in government is a challenging task when you're pushing through difficult things. The commitment that it takes, the impact on our families and on our friends is not, a small part. So I pay tribute to everybody that commits their life to politics, but also to the ministers. It's going to be late nights, it's going to be extra work, and I thank them for that. Genuinely, I thank them for that effort. So we wish them well, and we hope they make a positive impact for the wider interests of the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Bill Patterson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to speak on this motion on the appointment of junior Scottish ministers. Each of the new ministers brings a great deal of experience and skills to the Scottish Government. I've worked closely with Joe Fitzpatrick, particularly over the last 6 years, Joe being the SNP Group Secretary and I being the Group Convener. His ability to pay attention to detail and, at the same time, the boundless energy that Joe donates to any task will stand him in good stead for the challenges ahead. But more importantly, this Parliament will benefit much from his way of working. I've known Margaret Burgess for many, many years, maybe too long. Not in any way in Margaret's regard, but maybe mine. But when Margaret was first elected, my first thought was, with her knowledge on social matters and the way that she is able to express them, she leaves you in no doubt that not only does she know her subject, but feels for it as well. I believe she has already proved in her time in this Parliament that she is a very fitting minister for the welfare and housing portfolio. Well done, Margaret. Paul Wheelhouse is another energetic addition to the government. He has the ability to articulate complex issues into words easily understandable, an attribute that fits very well with the environmental and climate change portfolio. I think there's general agreement across the chamber that Hamza Yousaf has carried himself extremely well since being elected. I've enjoyed his thoughtful contributions in the chamber, which are delivered with great care and attention. Although some matters raised by members across the chamber can sometimes cause discomfort for opponents, Hamza never does so with malice. I believe he is extremely gifted and will enhance the reputation of Scotland across the world as Minister for External Affairs and International Development. Presiding Officer, in my notes before this, it says, say something about the big beasts. Well, you know what... Well, I engage with a lot of women's organisations. I'm not prepared to call Nicola Sturgeon a big beast. But if she stands up straight, I will call her nearly big. Seriously, though, no one can doubt her ability and work as Cabinet Secretary for Health. And I predict that she will take forward her new role in government with the same level of commitment and determination. I've no qualms, on the other hand, to calling Alec Neil that big other beast. No qualms whatever. The baton has been handed from an extremely effective and courageous Health Secretary to someone who will easily carry it forward. Knowing Alec so well as I do, I am more than confident that the baton and the Health Service are safe in this highly motivated, caring, big beast's hands. It is a big job, Alec, but it's a big man that's got the job. Presiding Officer, if I may, I would like to say a few words of those who are demitting office. First, Stuart Stevenson here, sitting on my right-hand side, even under the most difficult circumstances, has behaved in a polite and courageous manner to all, and that's not only in our group, but across this chamber. Well done, Stuart. Brian Adam is someone who I have sought counsel in and personal assistance many times. A whip doing a very effective work without breaking bones or hearts. Some attribute for a chief whip. Bruce Crawford is a man of the utmost integrity, someone who makes the deals and sticks to them. He knows all you need to know about this Parliament, procedure, process and even the building. But Bruce, never a know-all. To all three, a personal thanks as convener of the parliamentary group. The assistance that they've all given to me personally, I really couldn't put in record. I really do wish them all the best in the years to come. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd begin very happy to do so by congratulating my fellow Glasgow MSP Hamza Yousaf on his appointment to the government. He's always struck me as able and impressive. It's a little bit worrying that he's risen quite so quickly. I'd suggest he slows down his career, otherwise he'll miss his chance. He'll be resigning before he gets the chance to be our first Foreign Secretary. Margaret Burgess brings great experience to the issues of poverty and welfare. It's an area where this Parliament has severely limited power to protect Scotland from the UK Government's agenda. One more reason to make the right choice in 2014. Nicola Sturgeon's only problem, it seems to me, is one of acronym. The fictional Nicola Murray led a department known as DOSAC. Now, in her new title as Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, Nicola Sturgeon is seasick. I'm not quite sure if that was thought through. But it's been rightly pointed out that the Deputy First Minister has much to do at the same time as working towards a yes vote in 2014. I believe that economic recovery is a vital part of making the case for independence, but only if we define recovery in new terms. Back to business as usual would only mean repeating the last generation's mistakes, and I hope she has the vision to see beyond that agenda. Much of Nicola Sturgeon's previous remit now falls to Alex Neil, and he's going to have to raise his game if he's going to live up to her record of prolific tweeting. He's been entirely silent in that medium since before the summer recess. I'm sure there are some members who hope he finds the same restraint in the chamber, but it seems unlikely. While equal marriage legislation for same-sex couples is by no means the only important aspect of his new job, it's certainly one of the most anticipated, and I look forward to seeing him give the same clear leadership that I think we all know that issue needs. Paul Wheelhouse has another urgent job to do. The government missed the first annual target under the Climate Change Act this year. He must not only get back on track, he must exceed the next annual target if he's going to make up for the lost time. If the government's remotely serious about turning a set of targets from paper commitments into real-world delivery, he will need to be the minister that champions the radical action which has been ducked until now. The first test will be whether the forthcoming report on policies and proposals under the Climate Change Act is bold and fully funded in the budget. I urge him to ensure that both those two documents are presented to Parliament together to allow for the scrutiny that he agreed was necessary when he signed up to the Finance Committee report on last year's budget. I welcome also Joe Fitzpatrick to his role, but I hope he'll forgive me if I direct my final comments to Bruce Crawford. When discussions have gone well, and on those few occasions when discussions have gone badly, I have never found Bruce anything other than straightforward, decent and likeable, and we've heard that that view is shared across the chamber. I will miss working with him in his former role. I hope we see a bit more of him in the bar from now on, from time to time, and I wish him very well for the future. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Colin Alex Salmon to wind up the debate. First Minister.
Well, Presiding Officer, I think in the responses we had from Ken Macintosh and Jackson Carlaw could be described as the "see what you could have won" responses, in the sense that they both were candidates for the respective parties' leadership elections and both were not voted successfully into office. And I have to say, and I say this genuinely, that I was watching the backbenches of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and I could see many people wondering if they'd done the right thing back in the elections. I can't say that of Willie Rennie, because there was no alternative, if I remember correctly, to Willie, although I have to say that phrase which said that sometimes parties are not universally popular with our constituents, coming from a Liberal Democrat, showed a hitherto unsuspected talent for understatement on the part of Mr Rennie. Now, I have to say that this cooperation that we are seeing developing has gone very far, and I'm grateful to the local papers in Eastwood for supplying the final evidence of the extent of close cooperation between Mr Ken Macintosh and Mr Jackson Carlaw, because there they are, the Better Together campaign with somebody who looks suspiciously like a former Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland standing in between them as the Eastwood manifestation of that fantastic campaign which is moving round Scotland, stirring up antipathy wherever they go. And I have to say, I recognise every single one of these faces. I have a few Conservative activists and a few Labour activists bounded together. But I'm just wondering if the cooperation that we've seen today, the cooperation that we saw behind that stall in Eastwood, hand in glove as they are, is actually universally shared across the backbenches. I was noting that Neil Findlay, participating in the Edinburgh People's Festival debate entitled Independent Scotland, said of the Better Together campaign, well, we had that nice man, Alistair Darling, and home baking from his flat in Pilton. It is Pilton. Alistair stays in it. Laughter, along with Comrade McCletchy, wee Dougie Alexander, and somebody I've never heard of from the Lib Dems. So it may be that what we've heard today from Ken McIntosh and Jackson Carlow is not universally shared across Labour and Conservative benches. Now, there were references, and one from Ken McIntosh, to the question of the longevity of health secretaries. The point I was making this morning is that Nye Bevan was in office for 5 years and 6 months. Nicola Sturgeon managed 5 years and 5 months. The comparison I was making for Ken McIntosh's benefit is Nye Bevan resigned from the government after 5 years and 6 months because of the introduction of prescription charges into the National Health Service. And one of Nicola Sturgeon's many achievements as Health Secretary in this Parliament was the abolition of prescription charges in the National Health Service. And in terms of Alec Neil's move to health, then it's of fundamental... I give way to Mr McIntosh.
Could I just ask the First Minister exactly what Nye Bevan's views were about nationalism?
First Minister.
Nye Bevan was one of the great figures of the last century who believed in a national health service free at the point of need. Would that Ken McIntosh and his colleague still believed in that concept, championed by Nicola Sturgeon and which will be championed by Alec Neil as the new Health Secretary. Now, I'm fascinated by the concern that Labour have shown for infrastructure and investment as a cabinet post. Fascinated by the concern because I've been looking back at the record and I've found that in 8 years of Labour government in alliance with the Liberals in this Parliament, there wasn't a cabinet post for infrastructure and investment. Nobody was in charge of infrastructure investment, and that is because, of course, every Labour minister was thrilled to what Alec Neil has described as the PFI schemes. Schemes so disastrous and so expensive that even the Conservatives and the Liberals are turning away from that disastrous form of public investment. And that's why it is so important for Scotland's economic recovery to have Nicola Sturgeon at the helm of infrastructure and investment, seeing the capital investment that we need to take this economy forward, and also the powers that we need so this country can move forward as an independent nation. I move the motion.
The question is that motion number 4011 in the name of Alex Salmond be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. There are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 3924 in the name of Derek Mackay on the local government finance and occupied properties, etc. Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 3924 in the name of Derek Mackay is as follows. Yes, 96. No, 15. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is at motion number 3534 in the name of John Swinney on the financial resolution for the local government finance, unoccupied properties, etc. Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. I now close this meeting of the Parliament.